Hey, welcome back, friend. If this is your first time here, welcome home. And if you have been here before, I'm really glad you came back tonight. Get yourself comfortable. Pull the blanket a little closer. Maybe set your phone down beside you, or just let this voice carry you somewhere far away. Because tonight I want to take you somewhere you have never been before. Not to a battlefield, not to a throne room, not to any of the grand glittering places that history loves to talk about. Tonight I want to take you to a corridor. A cold, dark, narrow corridor inside a medieval castle in the English countryside. The year is somewhere around 1240. The stone walls are so thick that no wind gets through, and yet somehow the cold does. It is 4 a.m. The great hall is silent. The kitchen fires have been smothered down to nothing but ashen memory. Every lord, every lady, every knight, every page, they are all asleep. And in the darkest corner of the entire castle, in a small low-ceilinged room that smells of melted fat and smoke, a 14-year-old boy is already awake. He has been awake for a while, actually, because today is his first day, and someone has to light the world before the world wakes up. Before you come any further into this story with me, if this kind of slow, quiet history makes you feel something, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need a good night's rest. And if you are new here, a quiet little subscription means the world to this channel. It genuinely helps more people find their way here. I would also love to know, where are you right now as you listen to this? Tucked in bed, maybe on the couch, in that one chair that is somehow always perfectly yours. Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them. Now dim the lights as low as they will go. Maybe turn on a gentle fan if you have one. Let the air get soft around you, and let us go back. 800 years back. Here is something that might surprise you. When most of us picture a medieval castle, and I know we all have that image somewhere in our heads, probably from a movie, probably with dramatic torchlight flickering beautifully every 6 feet down a stone hallway. The reality was nothing like that. Nothing like it at all. Real medieval castles were dark. Not atmospheric dark, not moody cinematic dark. Genuinely, practically, almost terrifyingly dark. Historians who have studied the household accounts of English castles from the 13th and 14th centuries have found that candles and oil were rationed carefully, sometimes as few as 2 or 3 candles allocated per room per evening. That is it. 2 or 3 candles to hold back all of the night. The wide sweeping corridors you see in films, all the golden flickering light on stone walls every few feet. That is what filmmakers call atmosphere, but what historians call impossible. Keeping that many torches burning constantly would have been an extraordinary expense, and also frankly a terrible fire hazard, in a building made almost entirely of things that burn. So the truth is quieter. The truth is that most of the castle most of the time lived in shadow, and someone had to manage that shadow. Someone had to decide every single day exactly where the light went. That someone had a job with no grand title, no seat at any feast, and barely a line in the historical record. They were called simply candle boys, or lamp boys, or in the more formal departments of larger royal households, the servants of the chandlery. And the story of what they actually did hour by hour, night by night, is one of the quietest and most overlooked stories in all of medieval history. Let us set the scene properly, because this is the part I want you to really feel. Picture England in the year 1240. King Henry III is on the throne, a man famously obsessed with luxury and ceremony, who spent lavishly on candles for his court, and even kept records of exactly how many pounds of wax were burned at royal celebrations. The castle I want to bring you into tonight is not a royal palace. It is a moderately wealthy baron's residence. Not enormous, but substantial, perhaps 50 people living and working within its walls at any given time, and another dozen or so in the outbuildings beyond. A castle of this size would have had its own chandlery, its own dedicated candle-making room, and that chandlery was run by a head chandler, usually a middle-aged man with years of experience who reported to the household steward and controlled one of the most important resources in the entire building. Light. The lowest rank in the chandlery was the candle boy. These were boys between roughly 12 and 16 years old, usually sons of tradespeople from the local village apprenticed to the chandlery as a first step toward learning a real trade. Their days started before the sun. Their days ended after everyone else had gone to sleep, and their job in its most essential form was this: keep the fire alive, keep the candles burning where they needed to burn, and do it so quietly, so invisibly, that the people sleeping in those warm rooms above never had to think about the darkness at all. Now I want you to stay with our boy for a moment. He has been given a name. In historical fiction, writers have called him Thomas, or Edmund, or Will, but in the real records of the time he has no name. He appears, if he appears at all, as a line item, one candle boy, wages 3p a week plus meals. For tonight let us call him Edmund. Edmund wakes in a small chamber near the base of the castle's north tower. He shares this space with two other low servants, a stable boy and a young scullion from the kitchen. They sleep on straw pallets under rough wool blankets in a room with no fireplace and no window. In the winter months, the cold inside that room at 4 a.m. is something you do not just feel on your skin. You feel it in your teeth. You feel it in your eyes when you open them. Edmund has learned in his first 2 weeks of this work to sleep in most of his clothes. He sits up. He reaches for the small iron tinder box that sits on the floor beside his pallet, never more than arm's reach away, because this is the one tool he's responsible for with his life, practically speaking. A tinderbox in the 13th century contained 3 things: a piece of flint, a sharp-edged stone, a piece of fire steel, a curved piece of hardened iron, and tinder, a small bundle of dried charred plant material, usually scorched linen or dried moss or fungus, that catches a spark and holds it just long enough to grow into something more. Edmund strikes the flint against the steel, once, twice. On the 3rd strike, a spark catches the tinder. A tiny fragile orange glow, smaller than a firefly, blooms in the darkness of the room. He leans down and breathes on it, gently. Too hard and it dies, too soft and it dies. There's a real skill to this moment, a skill that every person alive in the 13th century knew because it was survival knowledge, and a skill that we have almost entirely lost because we have not needed it for a very long time. From the tinder, Edmund lights a thin rushlight, essentially a dried reed that has been soaked in animal fat and left to harden, which gives him just enough light to move by. He pulls on his wool coat. He picks up his small wooden box of supplies, fresh candles, a trimming knife, a small copper snuffer, a twist of new wick, and he steps out into the corridor. Here is what strikes me most about this moment every time I think about it. The castle is not asleep in the way we think of sleep. There are guards on the walls walking their rounds in the cold. There is a monk in the chapel at prayer before first light. There is almost certainly a kitchen servant or two, already beginning the long process of restarting the kitchen fire. But the stone corridors of the main keep the Lord's wing, the great hall, the gallery above it, those are silent, and Edmund walks through them alone. He walks through rooms that contain enormous wealth by the standards of his time. He passes the great hall with its long oak tables and its tapestried walls showing hunting scenes in faded blues and reds. He passes the door to the solar, the private sitting room of the Lord and Lady with its glazed windows and its finer furniture. He passes the storage rooms where the household silver is locked away. He's 14 years old. He carries a flickering rushlight and a box of candles, and in the entire castle at this precise hour he might be the only person moving through the heart of it. There is something extraordinary about that if you sit with it. The people whose names fill the history books, the lords, the knights, the priests, the merchants, they all needed someone to go first, someone to walk the dark corridors before they woke up, someone to make sure that when they opened their eyes the world was already lit for them. That was Edmund. That was the candle boy. That was a job that existed every single day in every castle of any size across medieval England, France, Germany and beyond for hundreds of years, and whose workers left almost no trace at all. Let me give you some numbers because I think the scale of this is genuinely astonishing. A moderately large English castle in the 13th century, the kind belonging to an earl or a bishop, might burn through somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 candles per year. That figure comes from surviving household accounts, the kind of careful domestic ledgers that stewards kept to track expenses. Some of the most detailed surviving examples come from the household records of Eleanor of Castile, Queen of England, in the late 13th century, and from the accounts of the Bishop of Winchester's household at Wolvesey Castle. 2,000 to 4,000 candles. Every single one of them had to be made, stored, sorted, allocated, carried to the right room, lit at the right time, monitored, trimmed and extinguished safely. And the majority of that work fell to the lowest ranked people in the building. Now the quality of those candles varied enormously, and this is where the story starts to get really interesting, because the candles in a medieval castle were not just candles. They were a status symbol, a social document, a physical manifestation of exactly where you stood in the hierarchy of the world. The finest candles, the ones that burned in the Lord's chamber, and the Lady's solar and on the altar of the castle chapel were made from beeswax, creamy white, slow-burning, nearly smokeless, with a faint, clean sweetness to them when they burned. Beeswax candles were expensive, deeply expensive. It took the entire wax production of a single beehive for an entire season to produce only a few pounds of usable wax. The candles that lit the great hall, the corridors, the servants' quarters, the guard rooms, those were made from tallow. Rendered animal fat, usually sheep or cattle, poured over a wick and left to harden. Tallow candles were cheap. They were also, by all historical accounts, fairly unpleasant. They smelled when they burned, particularly in a warm or enclosed space. They dripped constantly. They smoked. They required almost constant trimming of the wick to burn properly, a task so demanding that castles of any size had servants specifically assigned to it. And here is the detail that I find both fascinating and quietly heartbreaking. Edmund, our candle boy, the person who made these candles, carried these candles and lit these candles every single morning of his working life, would have used tallow candles for his own light. The beeswax candles he handled were not for him. They were never for him. He could smell the difference. He could feel the difference in the weight of them, the texture of them. And every day he placed them carefully in the holders in the Lord's room, trimmed their wicks with the special ivory-handled snuffer, kept only for that purpose, and walked back to his own cold room with a tallow candle stub. The light he gave to others was better than the light he was allowed to keep. By the time Edmund has completed his first round of the morning lighting, the candles in the chapel for the early prayer service, checking the oil levels in the iron lamp that burns perpetually outside the Lord's private chamber, trimming the burned-down stubs in the great hall and replacing them with fresh ones, the castle is beginning to stir. Somewhere in the kitchen wing there is the sound of water being hauled and a fire being blown to life. From above, the sound of a door. The steward is awake. Edmund pulls back into a doorway as the steward passes a tall, brisk man named in all likelihood something very ordinary like Robert or John, the most common names of 13th century England, without a glance in the boy's direction. This is another part of the job that no one quite acknowledges. The good candle boy was invisible, not ignored, exactly more like a part of the architecture, the way you do not think about the walls when you're walking through a room. You simply assume the walls are there holding everything up. The light was just there. It was always just there. And if it was always just there, that was because someone was always making sure it was. I want to pause here for just a moment because I think there is something in this story that reaches across 800 years and lands very close to home. How many people in your own life are doing exactly what Edmund is doing? Not literally lighting candles, of course, but waking up before you do, making sure things are ready before you need them to be ready. doing work that disappears the moment it is finished, the kind of work that only becomes visible when it is not done. The person who stocks the coffee station before the morning rush, the overnight cleaning crew that makes the office feel bright by 8, the parent who sets the table, the partner who checks that the door is locked, the friend who makes sure there is a full tank of gas before the long drive. Edmund and his tallow candle were doing something that every single one of us depends on in some form or another. We, just like the medieval lords sleeping soundly in their warm chambers, rarely think to look at where the light comes from. By 5:30 in the morning, Edmund's first round is finished. The castle's key spaces are lit. The chapel glows softly for the morning prayers. The great hall has enough candlelight to allow the steward to begin his work at the long table. The Lord's corridor has its lamp burning steadily. Edmund goes back to the chandlery. He is perhaps 30 minutes before the head chandler arrives, and the formal workday begins the long hours of candle-making, stock-taking, and preparation for the evening's allocation. He sits down on a low wooden stool near the small hearth at the centre of the chandlery, the only room on this level where a fire is kept burning through most of the night, because the wax and tallow stored here cannot be allowed to freeze solid. He is tired in the mild, ordinary way that young people who work with their bodies are tired. Not broken, just used. He holds his hands out toward the fire, and the warm light falls on his face. This is the world we're going to explore tonight. Not the world of kings and battles, not the world of grand strategy and political intrigue, though we will touch on all of that, I promise, because it all runs through this story in ways you might not expect. Tonight is about the world below the world of the people who kept the lights on. We're going to go deeper into the chandlery, into the fascinating, surprisingly complex and occasionally quite dramatic world of medieval candle making and the people who managed it. We're going to talk about the strict social hierarchy of light itself, about what your candle said about you, who you were, and whether your life mattered. We're going to meet the guilds, the Chandlers' Guilds of London and Paris, and discover that these quiet tradespeople were actually caught up in some surprisingly fierce power struggles. We're going to follow the lamplighter's route through the castle after dark and understand why this particular person, more than almost anyone else in the building, knew where all the secrets were kept. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I think we're going to find something that feels very much like now. Because the quiet work never really went away. It just changed hands. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. The chandlery fire is warm. The night is soft. And the story is just beginning. There is a room in almost every large medieval castle that most visitors even today walk right past. Not because it is hidden. Not because it is locked. But because it looks at first glance like a storage room. Low ceiling, thick walls, a single narrow window set so deep into the stone that the light barely reaches the floor. Shelves along every wall. The faint lingering smell of something animal and waxy and old. This room had a name. The chandlery. And if you knew anything about how a medieval castle actually functioned, not the way films tell it, not the way romance novels dress it up, you would know that this room was one of the most important spaces in the entire building. Not the great hall where lords feasted and deals were struck, not the armoury where weapons were oiled and sharpened, the chandlery, because without what came out of that room, everything else stopped working after dark. Think about what that means for a moment. We live in an age when light is so abundant, so cheap, so utterly automatic, that we genuinely cannot imagine its absence. You flip a switch, and there it is. You open your phone, there it is. You walk into a parking lot at midnight, there it is streaming down from poles you barely notice. Now take all of that away. Every candle, every oil lamp, every rush light in a medieval castle, every single one of them came out of the chandlery. Counted, allocated, distributed, tracked in household accounts the way we track expenses in a budget today. and someone was responsible for all of it. That someone in larger and wealthier households held a title, the head chandler, sometimes recorded in medieval documents as the sergeant chandler, particularly in the royal household, where the chandlery operated as a formal division of the king's wardrobe, essentially the medieval equivalent of a government ministry of supply. Think about that title for a second. Sergeant Chandler. It sounds almost military in its seriousness, because in a practical sense it was. Now I want to explain something that took me a while to fully appreciate when I first started reading about this. The chandlery was not just a candle-making room. It was a candle-making room, yes, but it was also a storage facility, a workshop, a quality control department, and in many larger households a soap-making operation as well. Soap and candles were made from some of the same raw materials, primarily rendered animal fat, and so the two crafts were naturally housed together. The head chandler was responsible for both, which meant that in a large castle household the person running the chandlery controlled two of the most essential household consumables simultaneously: light and cleanliness. Not a bad amount of power for someone whose name rarely makes it into history books. The physical chandlery itself was typically located on the ground floor of the castle service wing, away from the more formal living spaces, but close enough to the kitchen that raw materials could be easily transferred. Proximity to the kitchen mattered enormously, because tallow, the rendered animal fat that formed the basis of the most common medieval candle, was a direct byproduct of the kitchen's meat preparation. Every time a sheep was slaughtered for the Lord's table, the raw fat was carefully separated and sent to the chandlery. Cattle, fat sheep, fat occasionally deer fat. When the hunting season had been good, all of it went into the great iron cauldron that sat over a low fire at the centre of the chandlery. Rendering tallow is not a glamorous process. The fat was cut into small pieces and slowly melted over heat, not boiled, because boiling caused the fat to darken and take on a more acrid smell, but gently simmered, almost coaxed into liquid form. Impurities, connective tissue, blood scraps of meat floated to the surface and were skimmed away. The result poured off and allowed to cool was a pale yellowish substance, with a faint persistent smell of the animal it came from. Medieval sources make no attempt to romanticize this process. The tallow chandlers of London were moved around the city multiple times over the centuries because of the complaints from neighbours about the smell of rendering fat. Even by medieval standards, which were, shall we say, tolerant of industrial odours in ways that were not, the tallow chandler's workshop was considered unpleasant. And yet this is where Edmund's working day actually began. Not in the elegant rooms upstairs, down here in the smell and the heat and the slow, unglamorous work of making the thing that everyone needed and no one wanted to think too hard about. Let me walk you through a single day in the chandlery, because I think the rhythm of it is surprisingly absorbing once you understand what was actually happening. Edmund would arrive at the chandlery before sunrise. We have already followed him through his morning lighting round. But once that round was finished and the head chandler arrived to open the day's work, the real production began. The first task of the morning was checking the stock. Every candle in the chandlery was counted and categorized. Tallow candles, how many of each size, beeswax candles stored separately in their own locked chest, in many households because of their value, how many remained rushlights checked and bundled. Oil for the iron lamps measured in the small ceramic containers used for that purpose. Wicks counted by length. This was not casual. Household accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries, the kind kept by efficient stewards for major English noble households, show that candle inventory was tracked with the same careful attention given to grain stores and silver plate. Losing track of candles was a real financial problem. Tallow candles, while cheap by the standards of beeswax, still represented a meaningful household expense at scale. And beeswax candles were genuinely expensive. A pound of beeswax in the 13th century cost several times more than a pound of tallow. A single high-quality beeswax candle might cost the rough equivalent of a labourer's daily wage. The chandlery was not just a craft room, it was in economic terms a vault. Here is something that I find genuinely fascinating, and I wonder if you do too. The chandlery had its own internal hierarchy, its own culture, its own politics, even in the small, daily, very human way that any workplace develops politics when people spend enough time together in close quarters. At the top, the head chandler. In larger royal or noble households, this person was a man of real standing, not a lord, not a knight, but a skilled professional who had served a formal apprenticeship and accumulated years of experience. He answered to the steward of the household. He managed his own budget for materials. He could negotiate directly with outside suppliers, butchers for tallow merchants for imported beeswax. Below him, 1 or 2 journeymen chandlers, trained craftsmen who handled the actual production work. And at the bottom, the candle boys like Edmund, doing the carrying, the counting, the cleaning of equipment, the fetching, and the watching, and the endlessly repetitive physical labour that any production process requires. What strikes me about this structure is how recognisable it feels. A skilled manager, trained craftspeople who do the core technical work, and junior workers doing support tasks while they learn. 800 years have passed and the basic shape of a functioning workshop has barely changed. The actual production of candles happened in distinct phases, and the timing within the week and within the year was carefully managed. Tallow candles were made by the dipping method. Wicks of twisted hemp or linen were tied in pairs along a wooden rod. Imagine a kind of primitive drying rack. The rod was dipped into the vat of melted tallow, lifted out and held over the vat, while the fat dripped and cooled slightly, then dipped again, and again. Each dip added a thin layer of fat around the wick, like wrapping a parcel in ever-thickening cloth. A finished candle might require 30 to 40 dips with careful cooling time between each one to let the layers set without melting the previous one. This is slow, repetitive, careful work. It requires patience more than skill, at least at the basic level, which is why it was given to the candle boys. Edmund would stand at that rod for hours at a time, dip lift, cool, dip lift, cool. The smell surrounding him would have been constant and penetrating. The heat from the rendering fire made the low-ceilinged room warm even in winter, which was one of the few genuine advantages of working in the chandlery. For boys coming from cold sleeping quarters, a warm workplace was not nothing. Beeswax candles were a different matter entirely, and they were handled with correspondingly more care. The beeswax used in English castle chandleries in the 13th century did not generally come from local beehives. Records from the wax chandlers of London show that much of the beeswax used in high-quality English candles was imported from Flanders from the Low Countries, where a sophisticated trade in processed beeswax had developed to serve the demanding markets of the English and French nobility and church. This imported wax arrived at the chandlery in blocks carefully wrapped and weighed. It was stored in the chandlery's locked chest listed in the household accounts by weight, and treated with the respect due to an expensive material. When beeswax candles were made, it was typically the head chandler or a senior journeyman who did the work, not the candle boys. The process was similar in method to tallow dipping but required more precise temperature control. Beeswax had a narrower working temperature range too cool, and it did not adhere properly to the previous layer. Too hot, and it became so liquid that it ran off the wick before it could set. Getting it right was genuinely skilled work. The kind of work you learned over years, not days. Now here is a small detail that I think perfectly captures the texture of medieval castle life, and it is the kind of thing that history books rarely bother to mention. Tallow candles had to be stored carefully not just from theft or accounting errors, but from mice. Because tallow is at its core rendered animal fat, and mice in an age before reliable pest control in stone buildings absolutely regarded it as food. A poorly stored candle supply could be substantially reduced by rodents overnight. Candles were therefore kept in wooden or metal boxes, sometimes hung on the wall, to protect them from vermin. They also had to be kept away from sources of heat, because in warm weather tallow candles had an unfortunate tendency to soften, droop, and occasionally fuse together in a sticky, unusable mass. Storing candles was its own small science, cool but not freezing, dry, protected from mice, organized by size and type so that the correct candle could be found quickly in the dark. Edmund knew where every single candle in that chandlery was kept. He could find them by touch if he needed to. In a world where navigating by lamplight was itself an exercise in conservation, you did not light a new candle just to find another candle. That knowledge was genuinely practical. There is something I want to sit with for a moment because it connects to the broader story we're telling tonight. The chandlery was formally speaking subordinate to the kitchen. In the great chain of command of a medieval noble household, the kitchen was the operational heart, and the departments that supported it, the pantry, the buttery for drinks, the scullery for washing, the chandlery for light, were considered its satellites. But here is the interesting thing. In practice, the head chandler operated with a degree of independence that many of his nominal superiors in the kitchen hierarchy did not enjoy. He controlled a resource light that the entire household needed, and that could not be substituted. The cook could in a pinch change the menu if a particular ingredient ran out. The chandler had no equivalent flexibility. When candles ran low, there was no alternative. You sat in the dark, or you went to bed. This gave the head chandler a kind of quiet leverage, not the dramatic leverage of a knight or a steward. Nothing that would get written down in the chronicles, just the steady daily leverage of being the person who everyone needed all the time without quite realizing they needed him until the moment he was not there. Do you know someone like that in your own life? The person whose contribution only becomes visible the day it disappears. The head chandler has been that person for as long as organized households have existed. The chandlery also served another function that I have not mentioned yet, and it is one that speaks to how thoroughly medieval households were organized around self-sufficiency. In the warm months late spring through early autumn, large-scale candle production was significantly reduced. The days were long. The household rose with the light and worked until it faded. Candle consumption dropped accordingly. But the chandlery staff did not become idle. Instead, they used this quieter period for the most labour-intensive work, producing and stockpiling enough candles to last through the dark months ahead. A competent head chandler in a well-run household would aim to maintain a stock sufficient for at least 6 months of consumption at any given time. This was not luxury planning, it was necessity. If your beeswax supply ran out in January, you could not simply order more and receive it the next day. You would send a message to a merchant who would send a message to a supplier who might or might not have the goods, and the whole process might take weeks. The head chandler's ability to plan to forecast to maintain careful accounts of consumption versus production. These were the skills that made the difference between a household that always had light and one that found itself counting stubs at midwinter. In a very real sense, the man in the chandlery was running a supply chain. Centuries before anyone used that phrase, sometime around the middle of Edmund's first full week in the chandlery, something happened that he would remember for the rest of his working life. The head chandler, let us call him Walter, a name common in the records of 13th century English households, set Edmund to his first solo task beyond simple carrying and counting. He was assigned to wick cutting. The wicks for tallow candles were prepared from lengths of twisted hemp cord cut to the precise size of the candles they were destined to light. Too short and the finished candle would burn unevenly. Too long and the excess wick would curl into the melted fat and cause the flame to gutter smoke and waste the candle. Walter showed Edmund the correct length once, demonstrated the cut with the small knife kept for this purpose, and then walked away. Edmund cut wicks for 3 hours. By the end, his fingers ached from the repetitive work. His back was stiff from bending over the low table, and Walter, checking the results, said nothing which Edmund would come to learn over the following weeks was as close to a compliment as Walter ever offered. The wicks were correct. There is one more thing about the chandlery that I want to share before we move deeper into the world beyond its walls, and it is perhaps the thing I find most unexpectedly moving. The word chandler, the word we have been using tonight, comes from the Old French chandelier, which itself comes from the Latin candela, meaning candle, which in turn derives from candere, to shine, to be white, to glow. Every language trail for this word leads back to the same root, light. The people who made the light, who spent their days in a room that smelled of fat and smoke and hard work, were named at the deepest root of the word after the brightness they created. Not after the labour, not after the materials, after the shine. I think there is something worth sitting with in that. The chandler was named for the best outcome of the work. Not the difficult part, not the unglamorous part, the light at the end. We've been spending time in the chandlery in its rhythms, its routines, its quiet but genuine complexity. But the chandlery existed to serve the whole castle, and to understand the full weight of what these workers were managing, we need to step outside that room. We need to understand that in the world Edmund was born into, not all light was equal. Not all candles burned for the same people. Not all flames were permitted in the same spaces. The castle that Edmund moved through every morning was governed by a system of light so precise, so deliberate, and so thoroughly tied to social standing that a single candle could tell you almost everything you needed to know about the person burning it. That is where we are going next. And I promise you the story of what a candle actually meant in medieval England is stranger and more deeply human than you might expect. Somewhere around Edmund's 3rd week in the chandlery, he was given a task he had not been assigned before. Walter, the head chandler, handed him a small wooden box with a latch. Inside it, wrapped loosely in a piece of linen cloth, were 4 beeswax candles. They were pale, almost white, with the faintest tinge of amber where the light caught them from the side. They felt different in his hands, denser than the tallow candles he'd been making and carrying for weeks, smoother, and they smelled well. They smelled like nothing in particular, which in the chandlery was its own kind of remarkable. "These go to the solar," Walter said. "Set them in the silver holders on the side table. Do not touch the holders with your bare hands. Do not drop the candles, and do not take the long way round." Edmund carried them upstairs. He had been through the solar before briefly on his morning lighting rounds, but always in near darkness, always quickly, always focused on the small iron lamp near the door. This time he crossed the room properly to the side table near the window and set the 4 candles in their holders, elegant things polished to a shine he could see his own rough reflection in. And as he turned to leave, he glanced back at the room in daylight. The embroidered cushions on the bench, the painted wooden chest, the glazed window, real glass, which still held the quality of a luxury in the 13th century, casting clean light across a floor strewn with dried lavender. Then he went back downstairs to the smell of hot tallow and the low fire, and he picked up his dipping rod and continued. 2 rooms, the same building, worlds apart. And the difference that morning had weighed almost nothing. 4 candles, less than a pound of wax. That gap between the beeswax candle and the tallow candle was not just a practical distinction in medieval England. It was a social document, a statement about who you were and where you stood in a world that communicated status through almost everything: the cut of your cloth, the company at your table, the bread on your plate, the very quality of flame that lit your evening. So let us talk about that properly. Let us talk about what these two objects actually were and what they meant. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat. Specifically the sweet, the hard waxy fat found around the kidneys and loins of cattle and sheep. This was the most workable fat for candles dense enough to hold its shape slow enough in its melting to coat a wick evenly. Sheep soot was considered the best. Cattle fat came next. Pig fat was avoided where possible. It produced a particularly acrid smoke and an unpleasant sweetish smell when burned that managed to be both distinctive and deeply unwelcome in an enclosed room. The rendering process, melting the raw fat, straining out the impurities and allowing the clarified tallow to cool, produced a substance that was functional, cheap and widely available. Almost every household that kept animals produced it as a byproduct. The chandler's skill was in turning a kitchen waste product into a usable light source. But tallow had problems. Real persistent daily problems that you simply had to accept if tallow was what you had. The smell, for one thing. A single tallow candle burning in a small still room was not pleasant. A dozen of them burning in a great hall during a winter feast, as the dripping wax mixed with the smell of wood smoke and roasted meat, and 50 unwashed people, was, if we are being honest, probably something of an experience. The dripping was another problem. Tallow candles dripped constantly, coating candlesticks' furniture, and the hands of anyone carrying them with a yellowish, greasy wax that was genuinely difficult to remove from fabric. Medieval household accounts occasionally reference the damage done to good tablecloths and tapestries by carelessly carried tallow candles, and the burning itself was uneven. The wick of a tallow candle needed to be trimmed frequently, every 20 to 30 minutes of active burning roughly, because as the wick grew longer, it curled into the melted tallow pool at the base of the flame and caused the candle to gutter smoke and burn unevenly. The small knife or snuffer kept for this purpose was standard equipment in any well-run household. Tending the candles was for the servants assigned to it a constant ongoing task. There was also the problem of warmth. Tallow candles softened in heat. In summer, in a warm room, they could bend noticeably toward whatever heat source was nearest. In the depths of winter, stored in a cold chandlery, they became slightly brittle. Managing tallow candles across the seasons required a minor but persistent attention. And then, somewhat endearingly, there was the problem of mice, because tallow is at its chemical heart a food. Rendered animal fat is something any small hungry creature would consider worth investigating. Tallow candles stored without adequate protection were genuinely vulnerable to rodents. Medieval households kept their candle stores in sealed wooden or metal boxes, sometimes hung on the wall, specifically to defend against this threat. A candle eaten by mice in the night was a small, specific medieval inconvenience that I suspect no one complained about less because it was less serious, and more because it happened so regularly that it ceased to surprise anyone. Beeswax candles were almost the inverse of all of this. They burned cleanly. They burned slowly. They burned without smell, or rather with a faint honey-sweet warmth that was not unpleasant at all. They did not drip excessively. They held their shape even in warm weather. They produced a steadier, brighter flame than tallow, and they required less frequent trimming, perhaps once an hour or so, in typical use rather than every 20 minutes. For anyone who has ever sat reading by a good light and found themselves constantly adjusting trimming and repositioning a mediocre one, the difference matters more than it might first seem. The drawback was simply this: they cost considerably more. By the high Middle Ages, deforestation across much of England and France had reduced wild bee population significantly, which drove domestic beeswax prices upward. A pound of beeswax in 13th century England could cost more than 2 full days of wages for a master carpenter, one of the most skilled and well-compensated tradesmen of the era. To put that in perspective, a candle boy like Edmund earned roughly 3p per week. A pound of beeswax cost somewhere in the range of 4 to 6p in the same period depending on the source and the season. Edmund earned in a week of work less than the cost of the raw wax in a single good beeswax candle. This economic gap had direct visible consequences for life inside the castle. In the lord's private chambers, the solar, the ladies' sitting room and the castle, chapel beeswax candles only. Clean light, no smoke, no animal smell. The kind of flame you could read by or sew by or simply sit near on a winter evening without your eyes watering. In the great hall during formal dinners a mixture. The high table where the lord, the lady, their principal guests and senior household officers sat would have had beeswax candles displayed in good candlesticks. The lower tables where lesser guests and senior servants ate would have had tallow. In the flickering light of a medieval hall you could sometimes judge exactly where a person sat in the room's hierarchy by the quality of the light above them. In the service areas, the corridors, the guard rooms, the kitchens, the servants' sleeping quarters, tallow only and often not very much of it. Now there is a detail about candle stubs and perquisites, the formal word for the incidental benefits that came with household service, that I want to share, because it captures something true about medieval domestic life in a way that few other facts do. Royalty, and by extension the highest nobility, only ever burned fresh candles. Every evening new candles were set in the holders of the lord's private rooms. At the end of the evening, whatever remained an inch of beeswax, perhaps a stub still holding a modest flame, was collected, and those stubs were not thrown away, they were redistributed. The Constitutio Domus Regis, the royal household ordinance from around 1136, one of the earlier surviving documents of its kind for England, specified in precise and quite remarkable detail exactly which household officers were entitled to receive candle stubs as part of their compensation, not as charity, not as a handout, as a right. A senior marshal of the court eating away from the royal table was entitled to receive each day 1 small wax candle and 24 candle stubs. The ushers of the chamber received 8 candle ends per day for their own use. These were listed alongside the wages in silver and allowances of bread and wine. Candle ends were compensation. Candle ends were a line item in the medieval equivalent of an employment contract. Think about what that reveals. Light was valuable enough that leftover fractions of it were considered worth distributing formally in writing under royal authority. The smallest unit of illumination, an inch of wax, the leavings of someone else's evening, had real value in the world Edmund inhabited, and Edmund himself, Edmund, got nothing. The candle ends from the rooms he served went upward through the hierarchy, not downward. The servants of the servants at the very bottom of the castle's domestic order relied on whatever tallow stubs remained after the tallow candles themselves had burned to nothing. The boys who made and tended the light lived largely in the dark. There is something I've been sitting with as I tell this story, and I want to share it, because I think it matters beyond the history. We tend to romanticize candlelight. We light candles for dinner and call it atmosphere. We put them on birthday cakes as celebration. We burn them in beautiful holders on our windowsills and coffee tables, and they make our spaces feel warm, intimate, intentional, and all of that is real. The warmth of candlelight is genuinely different from electric light, softer on the eyes, more diffuse, kinder to faces. There is a reason we still reach for candles when we want a room to feel a certain way. But for Edmund and for millions of people across medieval Europe, candlelight was not atmosphere, it was survival infrastructure. The difference between having adequate light in the evening and not having it was the difference between being able to work after dark or being forced to stop. between completing accounts or leaving them unfinished, between sewing a torn piece of clothing or going to bed wearing it torn, between reading and not reading, though for most of the population literacy was not the constraint anyway, and the quality of the light you had access to mapped almost perfectly onto the quality of your life in other ways. If you burned beeswax, you were likely well-fed, warmly clothed, and sleeping in a room with a proper fireplace. If you burned tallow, you were likely managing. If you were rubbing a rushlight, a dried reed soaked in fat, the cheapest possible light source, you were probably cold-hungry and hoping nothing serious went wrong this winter. The candle you could afford was a nearly perfect proxy for where you stood in the world. Let me tell you about one more layer of this, because it is the one I find most unexpectedly moving: the church. Medieval Christian theology had something very particular to say about beeswax, and it shaped how people understood these candles at a level far deeper than simple economics. Medieval liturgical writers taught that the beeswax from which altar candles were made was a substance of profound purity. The reasoning went like this. These medieval thinkers believed reproduced without the act of physical union, they were observed as a colony with what seemed to be an almost virginal kind of labour, producing something sweet and clean and useful from flowers and air, and their own mysterious industry. No other creature seemed to generate so useful a substance so cleanly. From this the Church drew a theological parallel. The pure wax of the bee symbolized the pure flesh of Christ received from the Virgin Mary. The wick enclosed within the wax represented his soul, and the flame, that living, giving, consuming brightness at the top, represented his divinity. 3 parts of a single candle, 3 parts of a single divine mystery. This was not considered a fanciful metaphor in the 13th century. It was genuine theological conviction, and it had real practical force. Church law required in some form or another at various times and in various ways across the medieval period that the candles burned on altars contain a significant proportion of beeswax. In European cathedrals, some interpretations of canon law held that altar candles should be composed of at least 60% beeswax. Tallow was considered unsuitable, not because of the smell, though the smell certainly did not help, but because tallow came from slaughtered animals. It smelled of fat and death. It could not carry the theological weight that beeswax carried, and so in the medieval chapel of Edmund's Castle, a modest but genuinely devout space, used daily for prayers by the household, the candles on the altar were beeswax, not because the Lord was particularly wealthy or especially generous, but because that was the minimum that faith required. Edmund carried those candles to the chapel. He set them in their holders. He lit them from the flame of the ever-burning lamp at the chapel door. He didn't know the full theology behind it. He might have known the general idea that these candles were holy, that they mattered in a way the tallow ones did not, that they required more care. But whether he knew the theology or not, he handled them differently, more slowly, more carefully, as if he could sense in his hands that they were asking something of him beyond the ordinary. The gap between beeswax and tallow was on the surface a gap between comfort and inconvenience, a gap between pleasant light and unpleasant light, between a candle that smelled good and one that did not. But underneath that practical surface it was a map of the entire medieval social order. Who got the best of things and who got the remainder? Who lived in the warm glow of careful abundance and who made do with whatever was left? Who held the light and who carried it? Edmund held the candles for other people for years. The lights he built he did not keep. The quality of light he spent his days producing was not the quality of light he was permitted to burn. That particular kind of generosity, the giving of something you cannot afford yourself, is not unique to the 13th century. It is in fact one of the oldest shapes that human labour takes, We've been looking at the chandlery from the inside, its rhythms, its social architecture, the strange poetry of beeswax and tallow and the gap between them. But there is an entire world outside that room that we have not explored yet. The chandlery, for all its importance, did not operate in isolation. It was part of a larger system, a system of trade and guild law and professional rivalry so surprisingly fierce that it ended up in the courts of medieval London more than once. Because out there in the world beyond the castle walls the chandlers were organised, and organised people with something worth protecting can be remarkably tenacious. That story is coming up next, and I think you're going to find it considerably more dramatic than a room full of candles might lead you to expect. In the year 1300, somewhere in the tangled commercial heart of medieval London, a man named Matthew Le Chandler was doing what he did most days. He was setting the price of candles, not just for himself, for the whole city. Matthew, together with a group of fellow tallow chandlers, had gathered to establish what the records call the Assize of Candles, a formal collective agreement among the tradespeople of London to fix the price at which tallow candles would be sold across the city. This was not unusual. Medieval London operated through a system of guilds and trade associations that regulated almost every commercial transaction of any significance. Prices were set collectively. Standards were enforced collectively. The market, as we might think of it today, free, competitive, unpredictable, was not quite the model that medieval London ran on. Order was the model. Known quantities, agreed prices, regulated quality. So Matthew and his colleagues met, agreed on their figures, and presumably went back to their shops satisfied with a morning's work well done. Then a servant of the king's clerk arrived. We do not know exactly what was said. The record as it survives gives us the outcome rather than the conversation. The servant struck Matthew Le Chandler over the proposed rise in candle prices. A royal official personally and physically hit a candlemaker in the street over the price of tallow candles. The matter went before the city authorities. The servant was fined several casks of wine and threatened with imprisonment if he ever raised his hand against Matthew or any of his fellow chandlers again. I love this story. Not for the violence of it, the slap itself is hardly dramatic by the standards of medieval London, where public disputes were a normal feature of commercial life, but for what it reveals. Candle prices mattered enough that a royal official lost his temper about them in public, and the chandlers had enough collective standing that the city came down on their side. These were not marginal people, these were tradespeople with real economic power, and they were just beginning to organise. To understand the guild wars, the slow-grinding, legally minded conflicts that erupted between London's chandlers over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries, you have to understand the structure of the thing they were fighting over. Medieval London's trade guilds were at their core cartels with charitable departments. That sounds cynical, but it is actually a fairly accurate description. A guild controlled who could enter a trade. You served an apprenticeship to a recognised master. You completed your training. You became a freeman of the guild, which gave you the right to practice your trade independently within the city. And in exchange for that right, you submitted to the guild's rules on prices, quality standards, and conduct. The system was in many ways genuinely good for consumers. It kept quality up. It ensured that tradespeople knew what they were doing before they were allowed to do it professionally. It provided a kind of medieval social safety net guilds, supported their sick members, provided for widows, built almshouses for the elderly. But it also kept competition controlled. Numbers in any given trade were limited, which kept prices stable and not coincidentally profitable. Entry was restricted, outsiders were excluded. And when two guilds occupied adjacent territories, when the lines between what counted as one trade and what counted as another were blurry, the conflicts could become surprisingly intense. The chandlers of London had exactly this problem. On one side, the tallow chandlers, formed around 1300 anchored in the cheaper end of the market, making the workday candles that lit the homes and workshops and guardrooms and kitchens of ordinary London. Their raw material came from slaughterhouses and butchers. Their product smelled. Their workshops were relocated multiple times across the city over the decades because the neighbours complained incessantly about the stench of rendered fat, but they were everywhere. They were essential. By the early 15th century, the City of London had made tallow candles compulsory for street lighting. Homeowners were required by law to hang lanterns outside their houses at specified hours, and tallow candles were what they burned. The tallow chandlers did not just supply private households, they supplied the infrastructure of the city itself. On the other side, the wax chandlers, smaller, more exclusive, dealing in a luxury product for a luxury market, the church, the nobility, the royal household. In a 1319 tax list, only 11 wax chandlers appear in the records for the entire City of London. 11, for a city of perhaps 80,000 people. But those 11 served the clients who mattered most, and the product they sold commanded prices that made ordinary commerce look modest. By 1330, the wax chandlers were already organised enough, already prestigious enough, to be among the 20 trade guilds invited to make a financial contribution to support King Edward III's wars against France. Their contribution was 40 shillings. The mercers, the wealthiest guild in London, gave £40. So the wax chandlers were not at the top of the prosperity table, but they were at the table. That was the point. That was what mattered. Now here is where the story gets interesting. The two guilds operated in different markets, served different customers, and used different raw materials. In theory, they should not have had much to fight about. In practice, the line between beeswax and tallow was exactly where the trouble lived. Because beeswax was expensive and tallow was cheap, there was an entirely predictable temptation for a less scrupulous candle maker to pass off adulterated goods as the real thing. A candle that was mostly tallow with just enough beeswax added to give it the right colour and a faint honey smell. A torch that was sold as pure wax but was actually packed with resin and cheaper fat. A batch of altar candles that under examination turned out to contain significantly less beeswax than they were supposed to. This was not a minor inconvenience. Beeswax cost 6pence a pound in 14th century London, the price of a good pair of shoes or a full day's wages for a skilled artisan. Selling adulterated beeswax at beeswax prices was fraud of a meaningful scale, and it happened. Regularly enough that the city had to act. In 1358, London's city authorities issued a new set of ordinances specifically governing the adulteration of beeswax. The catalyst, according to the records that survive, was a scandal. An influential Italian-born merchant, a spicer and apothecary, of some standing in the city, which tells you that this was not a small workshop operator, but someone with real commercial connections, had been caught producing what the documents call a false torch. A torch sold as beeswax, not made of beeswax. This scandal was significant enough to bring the whole question of wax quality before the city authorities. The 1358 ordinances were direct. Any London wax chandler who produced candles that were not of pure new wax, or who falsified the weight of what they sold, faced imprisonment, a fine, or a spell in the pillory. Repeat offenders faced something the documents phrase with a particular medieval elegance. They were to forswear the city and all tortures and such work. Banished. From London itself, and from the trade. The pillory, for those unfamiliar with it as a punishment, was not just unpleasant. It was public in the most complete sense. Offenders were locked in a wooden frame in the busiest possible street, at the busiest possible hour, and held there while the city had its opinion of them. Medieval London had specific views about the right location for maximum public exposure ordinances from the period note that offenders should be placed where the most confluence of people shall be. For a chandler whose reputation was his livelihood, public humiliation in Cheapside on a market day was not a fine. It was a kind of professional ending. The 1,358 ordinances also included a provision that in the dry language of the record sounds almost casual. 2 or 4 of the most lawful folks of the trade were to be appointed to present any violations to the mayor. In other words, self-policing. The guild was to watch itself report its own members and bring cases forward. The records add with a wryness that 800 years have not entirely erased this does not seem to have happened. Asking a trade guild to enthusiastically report its own members for fraud turned out to be perhaps predictably less effective than the city might have hoped, which set the stage for the ordinances of 1371 and the moment when the wax chandlers finally got serious. The 1,371 ordinances were different in kind, not just in degree. For the first time, the fraternity of wax chandlers, as they called themselves in their petition to the Court of Aldermen, appointed 2 permanent named overseers of their trade. The significance of that step is easy to underestimate. Having permanent officials meant having an organisation that existed continuously, not just when a crisis forced people into a room together. It meant having people whose actual job was to maintain standards. It meant in practical terms that the wax chandlers had graduated from being a loose association of people in the same line of work to being an institution. The 1,371 ordinances also laid out the specific fines for dealing in adulterated wax. The penalties were graduated more severe for repeat offences, and they covered not just the act of adulteration itself, but the possession of the materials for adulteration. Every city chandler was required from this point forward to have his own identifying mark, a maker's mark, stamped onto his products, so that faulty goods could be traced back to their source without ambiguity. This was quality control with teeth, and the motto the wax chandlers eventually adopted for themselves, which has survived to the present day, captures something of the spirit behind all this effort. Truth is the light. 3 words. For a guild whose entire existence was built on ensuring that what burned in the churches and noble halls of England was exactly what it claimed to be. Here is a detail from the historical record that I want to pause on because it tells a human story that the dry language of ordinances almost hides. Some years after the 1371 reforms, 4 wax chandlers were sworn before the Mayor of London to investigate a new wave of adulteration complaints. They conducted their investigation. They found violations. They brought a number of tallow chandlers and ropers before the mayor and aldermen for selling adulterated goods, and then something happened that the records note almost in passing. Most of the accused were widows, women who had inherited their husbands' shops, women who were running small candle-making operations on thin margins in a difficult market, doing what they had to do to keep the business alive. The city, the records note, generally treated widows leniently. Shopkeeping was regarded as a particularly suitable occupation for women. The charges were largely dropped. I find this genuinely moving in a complicated way. On one hand, the widows were selling adulterated goods. That was real. The customers they sold to were being cheated. On the other hand, here are women navigating a trade system not built for them managing inherited businesses in a world that offered them very limited alternatives, making difficult choices under economic pressure. The city's leniency was not, I think, simply sentimentality. It was a recognition that the system created the conditions for the violations. That is a thought that has not aged as much as it perhaps should have. Let me tell you about the other side of the guild wars, the one that had nothing to do with adulteration. By the 15th century, the tallow chandlers had grown significantly in scope. They were no longer just candle makers. They regulated the trade in oils, ointments, soaps, and what the records describe with wonderful specificity as fat-based preservatives. By the 1500s, they'd extended their oversight to vinegar cheese herrings and sauces. This expansion made a certain kind of medieval logic. If you were already inspecting the quality of rendered animal fat, you were already in the business of quality control for a range of products derived from similar processes. The organizational infrastructure was there. The guild extended it. But it also meant the tallow chandlers were by the later Middle Ages something closer to a general trade authority than a specialized craft guild. They supplied 60 men to the city watch, an almost military contribution to civic order. Their tallow candles lit the compulsory street lanterns that made London safer after dark from the early 15th century onward. They were, in other words, a civic institution. The smelly, unglamorous, perpetually relocated trade that nobody wanted next to their house had somehow become essential infrastructure for the whole city. What I keep coming back to when I think about the Chandlers' Guilds is the strangeness of the world they inhabited. These were people whose entire professional identity was built around a product we now buy casually in decorative tins in airport gift shops and consider a mild indulgence rather than a necessity. And yet in their world the quality of a candle was a matter serious enough to bring before the Mayor of London, serious enough to land you in the pillory, serious enough to get you banished from the city. The standards they fought to maintain the insistence that beeswax should be beeswax, that a pound was an honest pound, that the mark on a product meant something, were not just commercial rules. They were a form of trust. The nobleman who bought beeswax candles for his chapel needed to be able to trust that what he was burning was what the church required. The widow buying tallow candles to light her family through the winter needed to be able to trust that they would burn as long as they were supposed to. The guild system, for all its obvious flaws, its exclusivity, its protectionism, its tendency to serve members at least as much as consumers, was built on this idea. That a trade was only worth anything if the thing it produced could be trusted. Truth is the light. It is not a bad motto for any kind of work when you think about it. Out in the castle, Edmund knew nothing of guild ordinances and city courts and pillory sentences. His world was small, the chandlery, the corridors, the long winter mornings and the shorter summer ones. But the candles he handled every day, the tallow ones he made with his own hands, the beeswax ones he carried with such care, were part of a much larger system of trust and regulation and human effort that stretched from the slaughterhouses of London to the beehives of Flanders to the altar of the castle chapel. He was one thread in it, a short thread near the bottom, but a thread nonetheless. The Chandlers' Guilds, with their court cases and their ordinances and their wonderfully specific punishments, were the public face of a world built entirely around light. But there was another world in the castle, quieter, more solitary, more intimate, that we have not yet followed into the dark. The lamplighter did not just work in the chandlery. Every evening, as the sun dropped below the castle walls and the great hall began to fill with the smell of the kitchen fires and the sound of the first plates being laid, someone picked up a lit candle and began to walk, room by room, corridor by corridor, up staircases and through doors and along passages where the stone absorbed the sound of every footstep. That nightly route, the actual physical geography of light inside a living, breathing medieval castle, is its own story. And it is a story about more than just which rooms got lit. It is a story about who was trusted to walk through all of them. We are going there next. Vespers rang at 6. Not a clock. Medieval people did not have clocks, not the kind that hung on walls or sat on mantelpieces. What they had was the bell in the castle chapel, rung at the canonical hours, the 8 fixed points of prayer that structured the entire day from before dawn to long after dark. Vespers was the evening prayer falling roughly at sunset, and when that bell sounded across the castle courtyard on a winter afternoon, something shifted in the air. The light outside was going, and someone had work to do. Edmund, by his second month in the chandlery, had begun the evening round. This was different from the morning round in almost every way that mattered. The morning round was quiet. The castle was sleeping, and his job was to light it before it woke. He moved through emptiness. The only sounds were his own footsteps and the distant call of a guard on the walls. The evening round was something else entirely. The castle was alive, full of noise and heat and people moving through it with purpose. Kitchen fires roared, voices carried from the great hall, horses shifted in the stables. The steward walked the corridors with his accounting ledger tucked under his arm. And through all of it, Edmund moved in the opposite direction, not from darkness toward light, but ahead of the fading day, placing candles and lamps in rooms before the people who would need them arrived. Timing was everything. Light a room too early and you wasted candle on an empty space. Light it too late and someone walked into darkness, which was the kind of mistake that a head chandler noticed, and a candle boy did not forget. The evening route had a strict order of priority. That order was not written down anywhere Edmund could read. Few people of his station could read at all, but it was passed from one candle boy to the next, through repetition and correction, and the occasional sharp word from Walter the head chandler. The chapel first, always the chapel first. The oil lamp that burned perpetually before the altar, the sanctuary lamp whose flame was never allowed to go out, entirely symbolizing the continuous presence of the divine needed checking and refilling before Compline, the final prayer of the day, which came at nightfall. The beeswax altar candles needed to be set fresh. The small iron sconces on the walls of the chapel's nave were lit for the household's evening prayers. The chapel was also, practically speaking, the social centre of the castle's spiritual life, in a way that people who have grown up without daily religious ritual sometimes find difficult to fully imagine. A castle of any size held prayers at every canonical hour. The household chaplain was a senior figure, often educated, often with political connections. The chapel was not a side room, it was a primary room, and its light mattered in a way that went beyond illumination. After the chapel, the Lord's private corridor and antechamber. The antechamber, the outer room before the Lord's inner private quarters, was where his senior household officers came to report in the evening. The steward would arrive with the day's accounts. The marshal might come to discuss matters of horses and travel. A messenger arriving at dusk would be received here before being granted or denied access to the inner chamber. Light in this room needed to be steady, generous enough to read by positioned where the Lord would sit to receive people. Not excessive waste was noted, but adequate. Then the Great Hall itself. The Great Hall was the largest room in the castle, and in the evening the most demanding to light adequately. Its ceiling was high, its walls were stone. The windows, even glazed ones, were small and set deep to preserve warmth. Without enough candles, the hall swallowed light rather than holding it. Candelabra were used in larger halls, standing frames or hanging fixtures that held multiple candles and could be positioned where they would do the most good. By the time the evening meal was being laid, the hall needed to feel warm and inhabited, not like the cave of cold stone it actually was when empty. Edmund learned quickly that the great hall was where the candles he placed would be most noticed and most criticized. An empty room with a single stub burning in the corner was simply dim. The great hall with insufficient light was something the Lord remarked upon to the steward, who remarked upon it to Walter, who made his remarks to Edmund with considerably less ceremony. Now here is where the evening route becomes genuinely interesting, at least to me, and I want to take a moment to explore it because I think this is where the lamplighter's job crosses over into something that history does not often name directly. After the chapel, the Lord's antechamber and the great hall, Edmund's route continued to the solar, to the Lord's private bedchamber, to the ladies' sitting room if the household included one, up the back staircase to the guest chamber if any important guest was in residence. along the covered walkway to the upper gallery, and in a larger or more complex castle into the record room where the steward kept his accounts, into the small cabinet beside the great chamber where the household's wax seals and correspondence were stored, past the door of the room used by the castle chaplain for his private work. Think about that route for a moment. Edmund, a 14-year-old candle boy from a village family lowest-ranking domestic worker in the entire building, walked through every private space in the castle every single evening. He passed through the solar, where the lord and lady sat in their most relaxed, least formal hours. He entered the antechamber where the day's political business was conducted. He moved through the corridors adjacent to the room where important correspondence was written and received. He was in a very precise sense present everywhere, not noticed, invisible in the way that good servants were invisible, but physically there. And over time, over weeks, then months, then years of the same route at the same hours, what accumulated in the mind of an attentive candle boy was extraordinary. He knew what rooms were occupied when they should have been empty. He knew which doors were left ajar and which were newly shut. He knew where candlelight was burning at hours when everyone was supposed to be in the great hall for the evening meal. He knew who returned late from somewhere unspecified and needed their candle relit at an hour when most of the household was asleep. Medieval castles were not private places in any modern sense. Privacy as we understand it, the expectation of time and space unobserved, barely existed within the household structure. Servants moved through every room. Chamberlains slept on pallets on the floor of the lord's bedroom itself. Ladies in waiting were present for almost every waking moment of their mistress's day. But among all these people who moved through private spaces, the candle boy was the most invisible. Not grand enough to be a political figure, not skilled enough to be a craftsperson whose work commanded attention. Just a boy with a candle doing what boys with candles did every evening, which meant he could hear things, see things, know things. That knowledge was a form of power, even if it was never quite the kind that got named. Let me tell you about one specific detail of the route that I find both completely practical and quietly fascinating. The order of lighting in the evening was not just about serving people in order of importance, it was about timing. A single tallow candle in typical conditions without draught, burned for roughly 2 to 3 hours before it needed replacing or had burned down too far to be useful. Oil lamps could burn longer 4 to 6 hours on a full measure of oil, but required monitoring to ensure the wick did not burn dry. Beeswax candles lasted considerably longer than tallow and burned more evenly, which was another reason they were reserved for the most important rooms where relighting in the middle of an evening would have been a disruption. Edmund had to calculate this. Not with a clock. Clocks did not exist in this world in any accessible form. He used the bells. The canonical hours gave him fixed reference points spaced roughly 3 hours apart through the day. He knew that by the time Compline rang at nightfall, the first candles he had placed in the chapel would need checking. He knew that the Lord's antechamber candles set at Vespers would be burning low by the time the evening meal in the hall was finished, and the Lord retired. He knew that the hall candles requiring more frequent attention than the beeswax ones in the private rooms needed a second round of trimming and replacement before the evening entertainment, if there was any, was done. He was in modern language doing shift management by candlelight. And he was doing it without notes, without a watch, without anyone checking up on him in real time. He was doing it purely from accumulated knowledge of how his particular castle, his particular household at this particular season of the year consumed light. The question of season matters more than you might expect. A medieval castle in December and a medieval castle in June were almost entirely different environments in terms of lighting demand. In June, daylight in the English Midlands lasts from before 5 in the morning until after 9 at night. The evening round was short. The chapel and the Lord's private rooms might require attention, but the great hall could often manage on the light that came through its high windows well into the dinner hour. In December, darkness fell by 4 in the afternoon. The evening round began 3 hours earlier. The hall needed full lighting before the midday meal had even been properly cleared. The corridors, which had no natural light at all after the sun dropped, became genuinely impassable without a flame. Edmund's workload in December was roughly double what it was in June. His candle consumption was proportionally higher, his hours were longer, and the cold stone buildings in English winters hold their chill well past any reasonable point, made the work both more necessary and more unpleasant. There was a kind of grim fairness in the fact that the season when the castle was coldest and most uncomfortable was also the season when the light was most needed and the work was hardest. Medieval life had a lot of that kind of symmetry. Now I want to tell you something about the curfew. The word itself, curfew, has a history that I think is one of the more quietly beautiful etymologies in the English language, and it connects directly to everything we've been talking about tonight. Curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, cover fire. In medieval Europe, a bell rang at a fixed hour in the evening, typically around 8 or 9 o'clock, as a signal that all fires should be covered or extinguished for the night. Not a political restriction, at least not originally. A practical one. Medieval buildings were largely made of wood thatch and flammable materials pressed close together in narrow streets. A fire left unattended overnight in a hearth, a coal tumbling out a spark catching the rushes on the floor could take a city block with it before dawn. The couvre-feu was the physical object used to comply with this signal, a domed metal or terracotta cover shaped something like an overturned bowl that was placed over the glowing embers of the hearth when the household retired. It had small vents cut into its sides, which allowed just enough air to keep the coals alive through the night, so that in the morning a push of the bellows could bring the fire back without the labour of starting it fresh from flint and steel. In the castle, the curfew ritual was observed at the end of Edmund's evening round. After all the candles had been checked, trimmed or replaced, and after the household had retired to their rooms, Edmund or the senior candle boy on duty made a final circuit. Candles that were no longer needed were snuffed. Oil lamps were turned down or extinguished. The great hall, now empty, was walked once to ensure that no flame had been left burning, unattended near fabric or rushes, and the great hearth, the central fire of the castle's main hall which had burned continuously through the day, was banked. The embers pushed together, covered with ash to slow the burning, and in some households covered with the couvre-feu itself, that domed metal shell designed for exactly this purpose. The castle went dark in a specific order, the same order every evening, slowly pulling back the light from the public spaces toward the private ones, and then finally from the private spaces into the darkness entirely. And Edmund walked every step of that drawing back. He was the last person to carry a flame through many of those rooms, the last eyes to see them before the dark. Here is the detail from this nightly routine that I want to sit with for a moment, because it says something true about a particular kind of trust. The couvre-feu bell. The curfew was in its original form not a punishment. It was not a restriction. It was a reminder, a practical instruction. Cover the fire. But the covering of the fire required someone responsible, someone who was still awake, still alert, still present when everyone else had gone to sleep, someone who would actually do it correctly every night without being watched and without the possibility of being caught if they did not. In the castle, that person was the candle boy, or the lamplighter in the more specialized vocabulary of later and larger households. No one stood over them at 11 at night to ensure the hearth was properly banked. No one checked that the oil lamp in the corridor near the guardroom had been turned down to its safe setting. No one witnessed the final round. The castle trusted a boy, often a young one, poorly paid, low-ranking, with almost no formal power in the household, to be the last responsible presence in the building before the dark took everything. and in the records of medieval castle fires, which are not frequent relative to the number of castles and the number of years involved, given the extraordinary quantity of candles and open flames in use every single day, that trust seems largely to have been kept. I've been thinking about the word trust a lot as I put this story together. We tend to think of trust in heroic terms: the knight who keeps his oath, the lord who honours his word, the counsellor who speaks truth to power. But there is another kind of trust entirely quieter, smaller, and in some ways more fundamental, that holds together the daily fabric of any household, any organisation, any community. The trust that the ordinary work will be done, that the fire will be covered, that the lights will come on in the morning and go out at night, that the building will be safe when the people in it close their eyes. Edmund held that trust every evening. He did not have a title for it. It was not in his employment contract because he did not have an employment contract, but it was real. As real as the warmth of the hearth he banked, as real as the dark that settled over the castle after the last candle was snuffed. The night route was in the end something more than a logistical exercise. It was a map of the castle's inner life. The rooms that needed the most light were the rooms where the most was happening. The rooms that were allowed to go dark soonest were the rooms where nothing was private, and the person who held the last lamp, who walked the final circuit between light and dark, between the waking world and the sleeping one, saw both sides of a household that most people only ever saw from one angle. There is one more person in this story who walked through the dark corners of the medieval world and shaped how we think about candles and light in ways that most people have entirely forgotten. She had no official title. She left almost no documents, but the history of light inside the castle cannot be told honestly without her. That story is what we're going to step into next. Somewhere in the town of Bury St Edmunds in the county of Suffolk in the year 1239, a woman named Mabel received a letter from a king. Not a social letter, not an invitation, a commission. King Henry III of England required an embroidered vestment, a chasuble, the outer robe worn by a priest during Mass of exceptional quality. He had heard of Mabel's work. He wanted her to make it. What happened over the next 2 years tells us something remarkable, not just about one woman's skill, but about the world that women like her quietly inhabited. Mabel worked on that chasuble for roughly 2 years. When she was nearly finished, the king sent her pearls and spun gold to incorporate into the design. When the work was complete, Henry did something unusual, even by the standards of royal patronage. He called in a committee of expert appraisers, experienced London embroiderers, to assess both the value of the finished piece and the appropriate fee for Mabel's labour, because as the royal records phrase it with touching care, he did not want to offend in this matter. A king in the year 1241 worried about underpaying a craftsperson and arranged independent appraisers to ensure she was treated fairly. Between 1239 and 1245, Mabel's name appears in the royal household records of Henry III at least 24 times. 24 commissions, vestments altar standards, embroidered banners for Westminster Abbey work that was considered significant enough to be recorded at the level of the royal court, and she was operating the records suggest as what medieval English law called a femme sole, an independent woman conducting her own business in her own name, not under the legal covering of a husband or father. Mabel of Bury St Edmunds is for historians of medieval women's labour one of the rare named examples of a woman whose professional work was considered important enough that a king noticed, documented and treated fairly, which makes her both extraordinary and entirely representative of a much larger, almost entirely unnamed group. I want to talk about women and light tonight, not metaphorically, literally, because women in the medieval castle were deeply involved in the management of light, from the humblest servant who carried a candle from room to room to the lady of the household who oversaw the domestic accounts that paid for every pound of wax and tallow the chandlery consumed, and yet in the historical record their involvement is largely invisible. Not because they were absent, because the system that generated the records was not particularly interested in writing them down. Let us start at the lowest level of the household where the most hands were involved and the least documentation was kept: the chambermaids. In any castle of moderate size, the kind we've been living in throughout this story, there were at least 2 or 3 chambermaids responsible for the domestic upkeep of the private rooms. Their duties were practical and continuous. They made up the beds, they swept the floors, they emptied the chamber pots, a job that requires a certain temperament, and I will leave it at that. They prepared fires in the bedchambers on cold mornings, which meant keeping a supply of tinder and kindling, and knowing how to coax a flame from the previous night's embers. And centrally to our story, they managed the lighting of the private rooms. The chambermaids were the ones who entered the solar before the lady arrived to rest. They checked that the candles were set properly, that the wicks were trimmed, that the iron lamp on the side table was full of oil, and not about to gutter out halfway through the evening. They were the ones who brought the lady her personal candle when she wanted to retire from the solar to her bedchamber, not the candle boy who handled the public and semi-public spaces, but the chambermaid who had access to the most private rooms of all. In the hierarchy of trust we discussed when following Edmund on his night route, the chambermaid sat at a different level entirely. Edmund was trusted with the castle's common spaces. The chambermaid was trusted with the lady's most intimate hours. That distinction mattered enormously, and it was almost always a woman who held it. Here is something that I find genuinely fascinating, and it speaks to the quietly complex world that medieval women navigated every day. Embroidery. The great fine needlework that filled the long evening hours of noble women and their ladies-in-waiting, the altar cloths and bed hangings and decorative panels that were the primary artistic output of the female members of any wealthy household required exceptional light. Not just any light. Steady, bright, well-positioned light. The work of Opus Anglicanum, the tradition of fine English embroidery that Mabel of Bury St Edmunds represented at its highest level, used techniques that incorporated gold and silver thread, worked in patterns so intricate that they literally caught and reflected candlelight, creating a shimmering, almost living effect in the fabric. Producing that work by candlelight was itself a challenge. Professional embroiderers working in guilds were in certain periods explicitly prohibited from working by candlelight, precisely because the quality of the work suffered when done under inadequate illumination. The restriction was a quality control measure, but noble women and their ladies-in-waiting were not guild professionals. They embroidered in the evenings because the evenings were when the formal duties of the day were complete, and the household gathered in the solar for the quieter hours before sleep. And so the quality of the candlelight in the solar, its steadiness, its brightness, its position relative to the working women was a practical concern that shaped the entire experience of that work, which means that whoever managed the candles in the solar was in a very direct sense enabling or constraining the creative output of the household's women. This was not trivial. The embroidery produced in medieval noble households was not just a pastime. It was in many cases a significant economic and artistic contribution to churches, to religious institutions, to the decoration of the castle itself. 4 women working together during the reign of Edward I took 3 3/4 years to complete a single altar frontal for Westminster Abbey. The light those women worked by mattered, and the person who kept that light steady and well trimmed, usually a chambermaid in most households of this era, was enabling work of genuine artistic and economic significance. Now I want to move upward in the hierarchy to a figure who rarely appears in histories of this kind, but who was in practical terms one of the most powerful people in any well-run castle, the lady of the household. Not as a romantic figure, not as the embroidering noblewoman of popular imagination, though she might have been that too, but as a manager. In the medieval castle, the lord managed the castle's external affairs, the defence, the tenants, the legal obligations, the military commitments. When he was away, which was often his, lady managed everything. Everything. The kitchens, the stores, the domestic staff, the household budget, and that budget included the chandlery. Surviving household accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries, the meticulous, sometimes astonishing records that were kept by well-run noble households, show that the consumption of candles and oil was tracked as carefully as the consumption of grain or wine, because it had to be. A large noble household might spend anywhere between 5 and 15% of its annual household operating budget on light. In some periods, particularly in winter when the demand was highest and the days were shortest, the proportion was even higher. That budget was the lady's responsibility to manage. She approved purchases, she reviewed accounts, she noticed when the candle consumption was higher than expected and asked questions. She made decisions about which rooms warranted beeswax and which rooms would have to manage with tallow. The casual, generous lighting of romantic imagination candles blazing in every corner, the hall perpetually bright, was not the reality that a careful household manager permitted. Every candle that burned represented a real expenditure. The lady knew this, and she ran the numbers accordingly. I want to pause here and ask you something genuinely, not rhetorically. When you picture a powerful woman in medieval history, what do you see? A queen on a throne, probably. Maybe a commander leading troops in the tradition of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Maybe an abbess governing a great convent. What you probably do not picture is a woman sitting at a table in the castle's counting room reviewing the chandlery accounts. But in terms of practical impact on daily life, in terms of the decisions that actually shaped the experience of everyone living inside those walls, the woman with the accounts made more tangible differences on more consecutive days than almost anyone else in the building. She was the one who decided how long the winter evenings lasted. Not in a poetic sense, in a literal one. The number of candles allocated to the great hall for the evening determined practically how long the hall remained usable after dark. When the last candle went down and was not replaced, the hall went dark. People went to bed. The lady's decision about that allocation, her judgment about what the household needed and what it could afford, governed the rhythm of every person's evening. That is a form of power. It simply is not the form of power that gets statues made. Let us come back to the working women of the chandlery itself. In a castle household, the chandlery was typically managed and staffed by men, the head chandler, the journeymen, the candle boys. This is the world we've been following throughout our story. But in a domestic or rural context outside the castle walls, candle making was often women's work. By the 13th century, in small towns and rural areas across England, itinerant chandlers travelled from house to house. In the autumn months, typically around Martinmas, the feast of Saint Martin, on the 11th of November, when livestock were slaughtered before winter, and animal fat was abundantly available to make candles from the kitchen drippings that households had saved through the year. These itinerant chandlers were sometimes men and sometimes women, and in the towns, candle shops were regularly inherited by widows who then ran them sometimes with great skill and independence. Medieval English law under the doctrine of coverture effectively merged a married woman's legal identity into her husband's. She could not own property in her own name, could not sue or be sued independently, could not enter contracts without her husband's involvement. But a widow was different. A widow was, in the language of the law, a femme sole, a woman alone legally independent, capable of owning and managing a business in her own name. This was not an act of medieval generosity. It was a practical necessity. Someone had to manage the assets when the husband died, and the woman of the household was the obvious person. Within the guild system, widows could inherit their husbands' memberships and continue the trade. Some thrived. Some built on what their husbands had started and grew it further. Some, as we saw when the London courts investigated wax adulteration, found themselves in legal trouble when the pressures of the business became unmanageable. But here is the thing about those widows who appeared before the London courts, the ones who were accused of selling adulterated candles and were mostly let off because the city recognised they were in an impossible situation. They were there, in the records, named, not as appendages to husbands or fathers, as themselves, as chandlers, as businesswomen who had made decisions, good ones and bad ones, in the conduct of their trade. That is a kind of historical visibility that many medieval women never achieved, and they achieved it through candles, through the unglamorous, essential, perpetually ungrateful business of keeping the light going. There is a particular quality to the relationship between women and light in the medieval world that I keep returning to, and I want to try to describe it honestly. Women across almost every level of medieval society spent more time working under artificial light than men did. This is not a small observation. Men whose work was agricultural or military worked primarily outdoors in natural light for the majority of their active hours. When the light failed, many of them stopped. That was to a large extent what the day meant: the window of usable light. Women's work, the textile production, the food preparation, the care of children and the elderly, the household management, the needlework was mostly indoor work. It continued after dark. It required light to do properly. The women of the castle embroidered by candlelight. The women of the kitchen prepared the morning meal by the light of the kitchen fire, often hours before sunrise. The women of the laundry worked by lamp as the winter evenings drew in, finishing tasks that daylight had not been long enough to complete. Women's work in the medieval world was not bounded by the sun, which means that women, more than almost any other group, had a direct and daily relationship with the quality, availability and management of artificial light. They were its primary users in terms of hours of dependence. They were its informal managers in terms of the household decisions about allocation. They were in many cases its makers. The candles on the rural cottage windowsill were often made by the woman of the house, not purchased from a chandler. And they are almost entirely absent from the history of medieval illumination. The books that have been written about medieval lighting are largely histories of candle chemistry, guild economics and architectural design. The woman who made the candle from the kitchen drippings lit it at the window and sat beside it until midnight. Finishing the household's mending, she rarely appears. I think she deserves to appear. On one particular evening in the castle we've been visiting throughout this story, Edmund finished his night route and banked the hearth fire in the great hall. He was walking back through the corridor toward the chandlery when he saw light under the door of the solar. Late. The household had been abed for well over an hour. He knocked lightly the protocol for a servant who needed to know if a room was occupied before entering. The door opened. One of the lady's younger attendants, perhaps 15 or 16, holding a candle. Behind her the lady herself sitting at the window embrasure with a piece of work in her lap. The lady looked up. "The candles need changing," she said. Not a request. A statement of fact delivered without apology or explanation. Edmund changed the candles. He trimmed the wick on the lamp. He set a fresh tallow stub in the small holder near the door for the attendant's use. As he turned to leave, the attendant, whose name is lost to history as most names from this story are held, her candle a little closer so he could see his way to the door. A small act. Automatic, really. The kind of thing you do without thinking when someone is navigating a dark room. He did not thank her. It would not have occurred to either of them to frame it as a gift worth acknowledging. But she lit his way out. The invisible half of the light is not a metaphor. It is simply the part of the story where most of the women are. In the castle chandlery and the chambermaid's routine, in the lady's careful management of the household budget, in the widow's candle shops and the rural women making tallow candles from kitchen drippings on a November evening, women kept the lights on in almost every sense for almost all of medieval history. They just rarely got credit for it. Now, credit or no credit, there was another institution where light mattered with a depth and seriousness that went far beyond any private household. A place where the relationship between light and faith was so carefully developed, so precisely maintained over so many centuries that it shaped the entire world the castle existed within, the monastery. And that story of monks' beeswax bees and the theology of flame is where we are headed next. 2 a.m, not dawn, not even close to dawn. The middle of the night in the fullest, most absolute sense of the phrase that hour, when the darkness outside is so complete and so still that it almost has a physical weight to it. Inside the monastery church a bell is ringing. Not as an alarm, not as a warning, as a summons. One by one the monks rise from their narrow beds in the dormitory, wrap themselves in their wool habits, file through the cloister in silence and enter the church. Their breath makes small clouds in the cold. Their sandals scrape quietly on the stone floor, and at the front of the church on the altar and in the iron holders mounted along the walls the candles are already burning. Someone lit them before the monks arrived. That someone was the sacristan, the monk assigned to the practical care of the church itself. His responsibilities were, in a word, everything that made the sacred space function. The candles, the oil lamps, the altar linens, the bells. He was in the monastic world what Edmund was in the castle. The person who made sure the light was ready before the people who needed it arrived. Except that in the monastery the people who needed the light were awake at 2 a.m. to pray, every morning, without exception, every single day of the year. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the early 6th century by a monk in central Italy, and adopted with variations by virtually every monastery in Western Europe, through the medieval period divided the day and night into 8 fixed periods of communal prayer. Matins, also called the night vigils, was the first beginning at roughly the 8th hour of the night, which the rule calculated to fall around 2 a.m. in winter. The monks would rise, process to the church, and pray for an extended period before returning to their cells for further study or meditation in the interval before dawn. This was not symbolic. It was not optional. It was the structural core of monastic life, the framework around which everything else was organized, and it required candles, not a few candles, a reliable, continuous, well-managed supply of candles burning every single night in every monastery, on every day of the liturgical year. The arithmetic of this is almost stunning when you add it up. A moderately large Benedictine monastery in 13th century England, the kind that housed 50 to 100 monks, held 8 communal prayer services every day. Many of those services were held before full daylight or after sunset. Every one of them required the church to be illuminated to a standard that allowed the monks to read their liturgical texts, follow the service and navigate the space safely. Multiply that across several hundred monasteries in England alone, then across France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the rest of Europe, and then across the 3 or 4 centuries of the high medieval period, and you begin to understand why the trade in beeswax was not a niche luxury market. It was an industrial-scale religious obligation. The monastery's relationship with beeswax did not begin simply as a practical matter. It began with bees. Monks had kept bees from the earliest days of Western monastic life, and the reasons were initially entirely practical. Honey was a sweetener, a preservative, a medicine, and a trading commodity. In an age before refined sugar, honey was the primary source of sweetness in most of Europe, and a monastery with well-maintained hives was a monastery with a valuable resource. But as the demand for beeswax candles grew alongside the elaboration of medieval Christian liturgy, more services, more feast days, more candles required at each, the beehives took on a new economic significance. The wax was in some monasteries more valuable than the honey. Monasteries began to expand their apiaries, deliberately creating dedicated spaces, patches of orchard, sections of meadow arrangements within the monastery gardens designed to support bee colonies, whose primary product for the monastery's purposes was wax. A 12th century Benedictine monk writing under the name Theophilus Presbyter, almost certainly the same craftsman monk known elsewhere as Roger of Helmershausen, left detailed written instructions for the management of beekeeping and the production of beeswax for candles in his treatise on the arts, the Schedula Diversarum Artium, written somewhere around 1100 to 1120. It is the earliest surviving first-hand account of monastic craft production on this scale. What Theophilus describes is not hobbyist beekeeping. It is a serious managed enterprise integrated into the monastery's broader economic operation and calibrated to the liturgical demand for wax. The monastery was running a supply chain, in the 12th century, for candles. I find that genuinely remarkable every time I think about it. There is a question I want to ask here because I think it opens up something worth sitting with for a moment. Why bees, out of all the possible sources of light, tallow from animals, oil from plants, resin from trees, why did the medieval church develop such a profound and lasting attachment to the wax produced by one particular insect? We have already touched on the theological symbolism in earlier stretches of this story, the idea of the bee as a creature of unusual purity, producing its substance without the kind of physical union that human and animal bodies engaged in making something clean and sweet from flowers and labour. But the theological symbolism, I suspect, works so powerfully because it mapped onto a genuine and observable characteristic of beeswax itself. Beeswax, when it burns, produces almost no smoke. Tallow produces considerable smoke, particularly in an enclosed space. Oil lamps, depending on the fuel, can produce a significant amount of soot. But beeswax burns clear. In a stone church with limited ventilation, where dozens of candles might burn for extended periods during a long liturgical service, the difference between a smoke-producing and a smoke-free light source was not just aesthetic. It was a practical matter of whether the monks could breathe comfortably while singing the hours. It was a practical matter of whether the parchment manuscripts on the lecterns accumulated a coating of soot that would damage the text over decades. It was a practical matter of whether the stone walls and painted decorations retained their colours after centuries of daily use. Beeswax was better in every functional way. The theological symbolism came to meet a genuine functional preference, and the two reinforced each other into something that lasted for centuries. Every year, on the 2nd of February, something remarkable happened in every monastery in medieval Christendom: Candlemas. The feast falls 40 days after Christmas, commemorating the presentation of the infant Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem, the moment described in the Gospel of Luke when the aged Simeon recognized the child as a light of revelation to the nations. Since the middle of the 5th century, this feast had been associated with candles and with light. Pope Sergius I, in the late 7th century, formally established a procession of candles for this day. By the medieval period, the custom surrounding Candlemas had accumulated centuries of tradition and genuine communal significance. On the morning of Candlemas, the monastery's entire supply of candles for the coming year was brought to the church for blessing. Not just the altar candles, every candle. The ones for the church, the ones for the cloister walkways, the ones for the chapter house where the monks gathered for daily meetings, the ones for the infirmary, the ones the monks carried to light their way on winter nights between the dormitory and the church. All of it assembled in the church, blessed by the abbot or the senior priest, and then distributed to the various departments throughout the monastery. What Candlemas represented in practice was a formal annual accounting of the monastery's entire light supply. How much had been consumed in the past year, how much was in stock, what would be needed in the coming 12 months. The sacristan knew these numbers. He had to. Planning the monastery's candle supply was a genuine act of resource management, and getting it wrong, running short of wax before the end of a liturgical season, or miscalculating the demand for a major feast was a failure with real consequences. Some of the monks simply would not be able to read their texts in the dark. There is something almost unexpectedly corporate about this image, and I mean that in the best possible way. The annual Candlemas blessing was functionally an inventory review and a forward-looking procurement plan wrapped in 700 years of accumulated liturgical tradition. Now here is where the monastery's relationship with candles intersects with the world outside its walls, and with the castle we've been visiting throughout this story. Monasteries did not only produce candles for themselves, they sold the surplus. And in many regions of medieval England and France, the monastery was the primary local supplier of quality wax candles to the surrounding community, to the local parish churches, to the households of the nobility, occasionally to the crown itself. The relationship between a monastery's chandlery and the local castle's chandlery was often one of direct commercial exchange. The castle sent money. The monastery sent wax or finished candles. In some cases, the relationship went the other way. A nobleman might donate beeswax to a monastery as an act of piety to ensure that candles burned before a particular saint's image or on the anniversary of a family member's death. The economics and the theology were deeply intertwined. Buying candles for a monastery was not simply a commercial transaction in the medieval mind. It was a form of participation in the prayers those candles accompanied. When a merchant or a nobleman contributed to a monastery's wax supply, his money was in a meaningful sense going toward the perpetual prayer service that the monastery offered on behalf of the entire Christian community. The candle burns, the prayers rise, the names of the donors are remembered. That was the medieval understanding of the transaction. And into the middle of all this commerce and theology and sacred flame, the wax chandlers of London, whom we met earlier in the context of their guild ordinances, operated as the commercial intermediaries. Their beeswax came largely from Flanders, imported via London's merchant networks. The demand that made their business viable came substantially from churches and monasteries. When the Black Death struck London in the mid-14th century, the wax chandlers suffered disproportionately because their involvement in funerals and the preparation of bodies for burial put them in direct and constant contact with the sick and the recently dead. The records note with a plainness that is its own kind of grief most of London's wax chandlers died in the plague. What had been a business built on celebrating the sacred had in one terrible season been consumed by the ceremony that also required light. The candles at both ends of life. Let me come back to the monk in the dark church for a moment. The sacristan waking before the rest of the community, making his way to the church, with his tinder box and his supply of wicks, lighting the candles that would greet his brothers when they filed in for the night vigils. This person is in many ways the monastic version of Edmund. Same practical function. Same position in the institution's hierarchy, necessary, skilled, largely invisible in the record. Same fundamental task: walk the dark, carry the flame, have everything ready before the people who need it arrive. But there is a difference that I keep thinking about. The monastic sacristan understood in explicit theological terms why the light mattered. He was not just keeping the building functional. He was maintaining a sacred space. The candles he lit were not illumination in any merely practical sense. They were witness. They were the physical manifestation of something the monastery was expressing about the nature of the world. That darkness was not the final word, that the night vigils were a form of resistance against despair. that the light left burning in the empty church was a statement of faith as much as a source of photons. The rule of Saint Benedict describes the night vigils as the monks engaging in a spiritual battle against darkness, keeping watch while the rest of the world slept. That is quite a job description for the person who lit the candles, and it is worth reflecting on how differently two people can understand the same action, depending on the meaning their world has given it. Edmund in the castle lit candles because it was his job. The monastic sacristan lit candles because it was his calling. The candles themselves were identical. The meaning each person brought to the act of lighting them was the entire distance between a trade and a vocation. What do you think? Is there a difference between those two things in the end if the candles burn just as steadily? Either way, I have been sitting with that question for a while and I do not think I've fully answered it. By the 13th century, the monastery's role as primary producers of candles for their communities was beginning to shift. The guild systems in the cities were growing. The tallow chandlers had organised in London around 1300. The wax chandlers has been operating as a recognisable body since at least the late 12th century. Commercial chandleries in towns of any size were increasingly able to supply the local demand for candles in ways that monasteries had previously been the only institutions capable of meeting. The monasteries did not stop making candles. They made them for themselves, for their churches, for their communities well into the modern period. Some still do. But the moment when a monk's carefully managed beehives and carefully kept wax stores were the primary source of quality light for an entire region, that moment was finite. It ended gradually quietly as so many important things end. The guild chandlers took over. The commercial networks expanded. The monastery's wax stores became one source among many rather than the only source. And the light itself, which had been so intimately connected with theology and prayer and the rhythm of the divine office, became something more ordinary, something you bought, something you ordered, something that arrived counted and allocated in the chandlery of a castle handled by a boy named Edmund, who had no particular view on its theology. The light was the same. The world it moved through had quietly changed. There is one more thing worth noting before we leave the monastery behind, and it connects back to something that has been sitting under this entire story from the beginning. The monastery was the institution that more than any other in medieval Europe took the idea of unbroken light seriously. The perpetual lamp burning before the altar, the sanctuary lamp never extinguished, maintained day and night, as a sign of the continuous divine presence, was a commitment that required someone to be responsible for it at every hour of every day. Not symbolically, practically. Someone checked the oil, someone trimmed the wick, someone noticed when the flame was guttering and attended to it before it went out entirely. The perpetual lamp was only perpetual because someone made it so, because someone in the middle of the night on a Wednesday in February, when no feast was being celebrated and no community was gathered, and the church was completely silent and dark except for that single flame, someone got up and made sure it was still burning. That person is never named. He is part of the architecture. But the light he kept was the light the whole community woke to. And the longer I spend in this story, the more I think that the unnamed people who kept the perpetual lights burning in monasteries, in castles, in small chandleries in medieval London, in farmhouses where a woman made candles from kitchen fat by the light of the previous candle, are not footnotes to medieval history. They are the thing itself, the light around which everything else was arranged. We have followed the monks and their bees and their careful theology of flame, but there is a dimension of a light in the medieval world that is stranger and perhaps more intimate than anything we have covered so far. The castle, the monastery, the guild halls and the market streets of medieval London, they all communicated through light in ways that went beyond simple visibility. The language of light in the medieval world was extraordinarily nuanced. A candle placed in a certain window meant something specific. The number of candles at a table spoke before any words were exchanged. The lamp that burned or failed to burn in a particular room said things that no one would have put into a letter. That language, the layered, deliberate, surprisingly sophisticated code of light, and its absence in medieval daily life is where we are headed next. And I promise you it is more eloquent than anything you might expect from a world without a light switch. Consider something for a moment. Right now, wherever you are in a bedroom, on a couch, in that particular chair, that always ends up with the good blanket, you're surrounded by light that communicates nothing at all about who you are, what you believe, or what you want. The person standing across the room to understand about you. You flicked a switch. The light came on. That was the full extent of the message. Now imagine that every source of light in your world was expensive, finite, and deliberately placed. That every candle burning in your home represented a real decision someone had made this room, this hour, this particular quality of flame. That the number of candles on the table where you received a guest said something about how you valued them before a single word was spoken. In medieval England, light was not neutral. It never had been. And the people who moved through a candlelit castle every day, including Edmund, who had now been working in the chandlery for nearly a year, were fluent in a language that we have almost entirely forgotten. Let us start with the most fundamental version of this, the number of candles at table. When a lord received a guest for dinner in the great hall of his castle, the number of candles placed on and near the high table was not a matter of how much illumination was practically required. It was a statement. It communicated the status of the guest, the generosity of the host, and the relationship between them before anyone sat down. A single candle at a table meant you were feeding someone. 2 or 3 candles meant you were honouring someone. An abundance of candles, a candelabra, torches in the wall, sconces candles on every side surface, within the Lord's view, meant this was a person whose presence the household had gone to some expense to recognise. Medieval hospitality operated through these visible signals. The food told you what the kitchen had prepared. The seating told you where you stood in relation to the Lord. But the light told you with immediate and wordless clarity how the occasion was being framed. When the light was generous, the night was generous. When the light was sparse, the message was spare too. Edmund understood this. After a year of work, he had learned to read the chandlery's allocation list for each evening, and understand what the night was going to be simply from the candle count. An important guest in the chamber above meant extra beeswax for the solar. An ordinary evening with only household members meant tallow in the hall and nothing more. A feast day on the liturgical calendar meant a full complement of candles in the chapel, before Vespers whatever the cost. The light mapped the importance of things. Now let me tell you about something quite extraordinary, the idea of light as a timekeeper. Before mechanical clocks became widely available, which in England was well into the 14th century, measuring time required ingenuity. Sundials were useless at night and unreliable on overcast days. Water clocks existed in large establishments, but were complex and expensive to maintain. For most people, most of the time, the canonical hours, the 8 prayer periods structured by the monastery bell, provided the only reliable shared framework for dividing the day. But there was another method, simpler and more intimate: the candle clock. The practice of using candles to measure time dates back well before the medieval period, but it took a specific famous form in 9th century England, when King Alfred the Great, the West Saxon king who spent much of his reign defending his kingdom against the Danes and the rest of it, trying desperately to revive English learning and scholarship, needed a reliable way to divide his working day into segments. Alfred's solution, recorded by his biographer Asser, who lived at the king's court, was 6 candles. Each candle was 12 inches tall, made of wax to a consistent recipe, and marked at regular intervals of 1 inch. Once lit, each candle burned through entirely in 4 hours, with each inch mark representing 20 minutes. 6 candles burning in sequence measured the full 24 hours of the day, to keep them from being disturbed by drafts which would cause them to burn unevenly and destroy the accuracy of the measurement. Alfred had the candles enclosed in cases made of wood and horn, the translucent panels of horn allowing the marks on the candle to be visible without exposing the flame to air movement. This was not an eccentric royal hobby. It was a genuinely practical solution to a real organisational problem. Alfred had committed himself to dividing his day equally between prayer and study and the business of governing, and without a reliable timepiece that commitment was impossible to keep. What strikes me most about this story is how completely ordinary the object was. A king in the late 9th century measuring the passage of his day by watching wax melt, the same substance that Edmund dipped wicks into in a castle chandlery 400 years later, the same material that illuminated the monks' night vigils in every monastery in England. Wax was how medieval people told time, worshipped, communicated rank, and lit their way through the dark. It did everything. The candle also spoke in a language of ceremony that went far beyond its use at table. Nowhere was the symbolism of the extinguished candle more concentrated or more deliberately theatrically chillingly deployed than in the medieval rite of excommunication. The ceremony of major excommunication in the Catholic Church, known from at least the 8th century, and practiced through the medieval period, required a specific arrangement. A bishop wearing vestments of violet, the colour of mourning and penance, was accompanied by 12 priests. Every one of them held a lighted candle. A bell was rung as it was rung for the dead. A holy book was held open before the congregation. The bishop read the formula of exclusion, naming the condemned person, listing the offences and pronouncing the sentence in terms of remarkable finality. The person was to be separated from the body and blood of Christ, excluded from the church in heaven and on earth, judged as damned until they returned to repentance. Those present answered, "So be it." And then the bishop and the 12 priests extinguished their candles. Not quietly, not carefully. They dashed them to the ground. The candles struck the stone floor, the flames went out, the smoke rose and dissipated, and the person named in the formula had been, in the symbolic language of the ceremony, removed from the light of God. The phrase that came from this ritual bell, book and candle passed into English usage as a synonym for the most solemn and final form of condemnation. Shakespeare used it. Christopher Marlowe used it in Dr. Faustus. It persisted because the image was so complete. The candle burning ewer within the community of believers, within the circle of the sacred, within the warmth of shared light. The candle dashed to the floor and extinguished ewer outside all of that. Nothing more needed to be said. Let me pull back from the ceremonial and return to the everyday, because I want to show you how the language of light worked at its most intimate level in the simple daily signals that pass between people in a medieval castle without anything being spoken. A candle burning in a room that should be empty. Edmund on his night rounds knew which rooms ought to be occupied and which ought to be dark at each hour of the evening. The pattern was reliable, established by the rhythm of the household's routine. When he saw light under a door that should have been dark, it meant something. It might mean that someone was awake with illness. It might mean that a letter had arrived that required a private response. It might mean that a conversation was being had that was not for one reason or another intended for the great hall. Edmund did not investigate. That was not his role. But he noticed. And over months of the same route he accumulated a kind of involuntary knowledge of the household's private life that no one had intended to give him, and that no one probably quite realized they had given. The placement of a lamp in a specific window carried its own set of possible meanings. At the most prosaic level, a light in the gatehouse window told travellers on the road that the castle was inhabited, and that there might be someone awake to receive them. Medieval hospitality norms were considerably more robust than modern ones. A traveller who appeared at a castle gate at night had a reasonable expectation of being given shelter, particularly if they had any kind of social standing, and a visible light in the gatehouse was one of the signals that this castle was awake and potentially welcoming. At a slightly more nuanced level, the light in a particular window could signal to people who already knew what to look for. A candle on the left side of a specific window versus the right side. A light burning for a certain number of hours. 2 flames rather than one. Medieval life, in which everything was expensive enough to be deliberate and private communication was physically difficult. Letters were slow, walls had ears. The great hall was almost never truly empty during the day, generated exactly the kind of detailed light-based signalling that this environment would produce. People communicated with candles the way people in later centuries communicated with flags or Morse code, because there was no other reliable way to send a message at a distance or in the dark. There is a specific detail from medieval social life that I want to share because it captures the gap between the world we live in and the one Edmund inhabited more vividly than almost anything else. Medieval people slept differently than we do. The historical evidence from household accounts, monastery records, and the occasional detailed personal chronicle suggests that the standard sleep pattern in medieval Europe was what scholars today call biphasic sleep, 2 distinct periods of sleep in a single night separated by an hour or so of wakefulness in the middle. The first sleep began at dark after the household had retired. The middle waking, called in some period sources simply the watch, came somewhere around midnight. The second sleep followed, ending at or before dawn. During the watch, people did things. They prayed. They talked quietly to whoever was nearby. They had intimate conversations that the rest of the household could not hear. They checked on children. They lay in the dark and thought about their lives. And some of them, particularly those in larger households, with the resources for it, lit a candle. Not a full candle. A stub, perhaps. Something small enough to last an hour and give just enough light to see by. The light that burned during the watch was different from any other light in the medieval day. It was not public. It was not purposeful in any official sense. It was personal. The candlelight of the watch was the light of private thought, private prayer, private worry. It is perhaps the only medieval light that most closely resembles the light we reach for in the small hours ourselves, the phone screen, the bedside lamp, the lamp in the hallway that proves the house is still intact. We're doing the same thing they were doing, keeping a small flame going in the middle of the night to prove to ourselves that the darkness is not permanent. Edmund almost certainly did not know about biphasic sleep in any theoretical sense. He simply lived it. His working life began before the first sleep ended, and his night rounds coincided with hours when a significant portion of the castle was in fact lying awake in the dark between their 2 sleeps. The candle he replaced in a room at midnight was not replacing a candle that had burned through someone's inattention. It was burning for someone's watch, for their hour of wakefulness between sleeps, for the middle part of the night that the medieval world recognized as its own distinct territory, neither quite asleep nor quite awake. The light Edmund carried into those rooms was not an intrusion. It was expected. It was part of a rhythm as natural to the people inside as breathing. He was not just lighting rooms, he was lighting hours. One more thing about the language of light, and then I want to let this settle. The language was not only spoken by those who placed the candles, it was spoken by those who noticed their absence. A room going dark earlier than expected, a candle that should have been burning and was not, a window that had shown light on every other night of the week and was tonight completely dark. These absences spoke too: illness, departure, trouble. or simply the end of something a visit concluded, a guest gone, a presence withdrawn. The darkness after the light was not neutral either. It was the end of a message, the closing of a conversation that had been conducted entirely without words. Edmund read the darkness the same way he read the light. He moved through a world where every flame told him something about the night, about the people in it, about the relationships between them, about what the castle expected of itself and what it feared. He carried this knowledge lightly, the way people who handle important things for others always learn to carry knowledge, carefully, without demonstrating it, without using it, mostly. We've been exploring the language of light as it was spoken inside the castle walls at the high table, in the darkened rooms, in the ceremonies of the church. But light in the medieval world was also the subject of a very old anxiety. Not the darkness itself exactly, something more practical, more immediate, fire. And the people who managed light the lamplighters, the chandlers, the candle boys walking their evening rounds knew something about fire that the people sleeping in the warm rooms above them perhaps allowed themselves to forget. That light and destruction were in this world the same thing. Just the question of control. We're going there next. Every person who has ever knocked over a candle in the dark knows the particular quality of that moment. The lurch of the hand trying to catch it. The half second before you know whether it caught something or whether you were lucky. That specific combination of clumsy and afraid. Now imagine that same moment in a castle where the floor is scattered with rushes, dried grass and herbs strewn across the stone to provide insulation against the cold and a slight softening against bare feet, where the walls are hung with wool and linen cloth that was expensive to make beautiful to look at and would catch flame in seconds if a candle got within a few inches of it, where the ceiling beams are old oak dry as anything, and where there is no fire brigade, no sprinkler system, and no possible speed of response that could stop a serious fire once it had taken hold. In that world, knocking over a candle was not a minor incident. It was a genuine emergency. And Edmund knew this in a way that was not academic. He had been told it on his first day in the chandlery, and every day since had confirmed the lesson: you do not put a lit candle down on an uneven surface. You do not carry a lit candle near hanging fabric without shielding it with your hand. You do not leave a candle burning in a room you're about to leave unattended unless it is in a proper holder, in a proper position, with nothing nearby that could reach it if it fell. These were not rules for cautious people. They were the minimum conditions for existing in the same building as fire. Let us talk about what fire actually meant in the medieval world, because I think we underestimate it. We live with fire every day, the gas ring on the stove, the occasional candle, the backyard grill in summer, and our relationship with it is relaxed, almost affectionate. Fire is nostalgic. Fire is cozy. Fire is romantic. For the people we have been living alongside in this story, fire was none of those things primarily. It was infrastructure. Every warm meal depended on it. Every hour of work after dark depended on it. Every room that was inhabitable in winter depended on it. The smithy and the baker and the tanner and the potter, every trade that shaped the material world depended on controlled flame, and every single one of them lived with the knowledge that the same thing sustaining their work could also destroy everything around it in a matter of minutes. Medieval fire awareness was not anxiety in the clinical sense. It was competence. The people of the 13th century were not afraid of fire the way we might be afraid of something we do not understand. They were alert to it the way an experienced sailor is alert to the weather, constantly, practically without drama, because the consequence of inattention was not inconvenience but catastrophe. Let me put some numbers to this. On the 10th of July, 1212, a fire broke out south of the River Thames in the district of Southwark. We do not know the exact cause. The earliest account of the blaze appears in the Liber de Antiqui Legibus, the Book of Ancient Laws composed in 1274, and today preserved among the oldest records held by the City of London Corporation. Contemporary chronicles describe a fire that started somewhere in the crowded streets south of the river and spread with terrifying speed. The wood-framed thatch-roofed buildings of Suffolk offered almost no resistance. The fire consumed the Cathedral Church of St Mary Overy, which we know today as Suffolk Cathedral, and burned along Borough High Street before reaching London Bridge. London Bridge in 1212 was not the simple stone span we might imagine. King John had authorised the construction of wooden houses and shops along its full length, a dense multi-storey, tightly packed community of hundreds of people living and working above the river. The bridge was an entire neighbourhood suspended over the Thames. When the fire reached it, the bridge caught from both ends almost simultaneously. People had rushed from the south to escape the fire, and people had come from the north to help. Now both groups were trapped on a burning structure over deep, fast-moving water. Later accounts, written in 1603 by the chronicler John Stow, put the death toll on London Bridge alone at 3,000. Most modern historians consider this an overstatement, given that the entire population of London at the time was perhaps 50,000. But even at a fraction of that figure, the scale of the event was staggering, and this was the fire that for 4.5 centuries was called the Great Fire of London, not 1666. The 1666 fire is better remembered because it reshaped the city's architecture and generated excellent contemporary accounts. But the medieval blaze that tore through Southwark and London Bridge on a July morning in the early 13th century was deadlier in all likelihood by orders of magnitude. There was no fire brigade. There was no organised response. There was a bucket chain and whatever water the river could provide, and the terrible arithmetic of a fire moving faster than people could respond to it. Inside the castle, the specific fears were different in texture but related in kind. Stone walls do not burn. That was the castle's great advantage over the timber and thatch construction of most medieval buildings. But stone walls contain wooden floors, wooden ceiling beams, wooden furniture, wooden window frames, and wool and linen hangings. They contain rushes on the floor and tapestries on the walls and curtains around the beds. They contain everything that human beings in a cold climate need to make a stone building livable, and almost all of it is flammable. The Great Hall, which we've spent considerable time in over these pages, was in many ways the most vulnerable space. Its ceiling beams were heavy old oak. Its floor was layered with rushes, sometimes several inches deep, laid down in autumn and changed when they became too dirty, which is to say they were often quite aged by the time they were replaced. The walls were hung with cloth, and in wealthier households tapestries. Along the sides of the hall on feast days candelabra and wall sconces held dozens of candles. A single candle in the wrong place on a still night could make the rushes smoke. If the smoke went unnoticed, if the hall was empty, or if the person in the hall was asleep, the rushes could catch fully. And once the rushes were burning with the wooden ceiling above and the fabric walls on either side, the time between ignition and catastrophe was not long. Edmund's evening rounds, which we've already followed in detail, were not just about bringing light to dark rooms. They were a fire inspection. He was checking that every candle was properly placed and properly protected, that nothing had been left too close to fabric, that the rushes near the wall sconces were not scorched or smelling of smoke, that the kitchen had properly banked its fires and not left an ember sitting too close to the dried wood stacked beside the hearth. He was every evening performing the same function as a modern fire warden, without the training, without the equipment, and without anyone having formally named what he was doing. I want to tell you about a specific risk that Edmund would have known, and that most people today thinking about candles almost certainly overlook: the wick. We touched on this briefly when we looked at the chandlery's production process, but the fire safety implications deserve their own attention. A tallow candle as it burns produces a mushrooming of the wick. The charred material curls and accumulates at the tip of the flame, eventually growing large enough that the flame becomes irregular, and the melted pool of tallow around the base of the wick spreads wider than it should. If the pool of liquid tallow spreads far enough, it can run off the edge of the candlestick and fall onto whatever surface is below. Liquid tallow at burning temperature is hot enough to ignite dry material on contact. Rushes, for instance, or the edge of a linen tablecloth, or a wall hanging that someone had allowed to drape too close to the candlestick while rearranging it. This is why candle trimming the regular cutting back of the wick with a small knife or snuffer was not a courtesy or a comfort measure. It was fire safety. A well-trimmed wick produced a steady, controlled flame and a contained melted pool. An untrimmed wick was a slow accumulation of risk. Edmund trimmed wicks the way a careful driver checks their mirrors automatically constantly, as part of the basic practice of being in charge of something with consequences. Now, what happened when things did go wrong? The medieval firefighting options were by modern standards almost heartbreakingly limited. The primary tool was leather buckets of water carried by hand, or passed along a chain of people from the nearest water source to the fire. In a castle, the nearest reliable water source might be the well in the courtyard, or a cistern, a rooftop or tower reservoir that collected rainwater and was kept specifically against emergencies like this one. The problem with water against a serious fire in an enclosed stone building was the time it took to deliver it in any meaningful quantity. A leather bucket held perhaps 2 gallons. A serious fire in a great hall with burning rushes on the floor and burning oak beams above was not a 2-gallon problem. It was not a 20-bucket problem. By the time enough people had formed a chain and enough water had arrived from wherever water could be found, a fire that had taken real hold was unlikely to be stopped. The other medieval firefighting tool was the fire hook, a long pole with an iron hook on the end used to pull down burning structures before the fire could spread further. The logic was brutal and practical. If you could tear down the burning section of the building, you could create a break that the fire could not cross. In a city, this made sense. You sacrificed a structure to save the street. In a castle, it was considerably more complicated. The castle's structure was not designed to be selectively demolished, and the stone walls that were the castle's great protection against fire also made pulling sections down almost impossible. The honest truth was this: if a serious fire started inside a medieval castle and was not caught very quickly, your options were primarily to try to save the contents, the tapestries, the silver, the documents, the books, and then to get out. This was known. It was not discussed over dinner, but it was known. Against this backdrop, the routines we have been following throughout this story take on a weight that I am not sure I have fully conveyed until now. The curfew, the couvre-feu, the covering of the fire, which we explored earlier in the context of its role as nightly ritual, was not tradition for the sake of tradition. It was the primary fire prevention measure in medieval Europe for centuries. Cover the fire at night. Ensure that nothing is left burning that does not need to be burning. Reduce the number of open flames in the building to the absolute minimum required. William the Conqueror, when he arrived in England in the 11th century, did not invent the curfew. He enforced it more strictly because he understood better than most people the catastrophic speed with which fire moved through the timber buildings of a medieval town. He had seen it in Normandy. He was not going to watch it happen in England without having laid down the law first. Every regulation that followed the Mayor of London's order in the 12th century that certain buildings be constructed in stone, the 13th century regulations requiring water to be available at all times in certain districts, the provisions requiring ladders and buckets and iron hooks to be stored in parish churches. These were the accumulation of medieval England learning slowly and expensively what fire required. Not just respect, procedure. Edmund, by the end of his first year in the chandlery, had a specific fear that he had not started with. Not a dramatic fear. Not the kind that kept him awake or made his hands shake. Just a very clear practical awareness that lived in his body, the way any important lesson lives when you have learned it through daily contact with its subject. He was afraid of the moment when he was not paying attention. Not the fire itself, the inattention. The brief period where the mind wandered from the candle in his hand to some thought about the morning or the cold, or the sound of someone's voice from the hall above, and the hand forgot what the candle could do if the hand forgot what it was doing. He had never had an incident. He had never come close to one that mattered. But he had seen in his first winter a kitchen boy carry a candle stub too close to a hanging piece of cloth near the kitchen entrance. The cloth had scorched, just scorched, caught briefly and been patted out immediately by the nearest pair of hands. No real harm. But Edmund had watched the kitchen boy's face in the seconds after the white quality of it, the particular stillness that comes with understanding how close something was, and he'd recognized with absolute clarity that this was the shape of the thing, not the fire, the moment before the fire, the window between careless and catastrophic. That window was what he lived in every evening on every round, and managing it night after night with no particular acknowledgement and no particular reward was perhaps the most important work he did. We've spent a good deal of time now with the people who managed light and its dangers in the medieval world. But there is one chapter of the story we've not told yet, the chapter about endings. The gas lamp came to London in the early 19th century. Electric light followed. And the world that Edmund inhabited, the world of candle boys and chandlers and fire watchers, and nightly routines built around the management of flame, ended. Not all at once, not dramatically, just gradually and then completely. The last lamplighters did not go to bed one night knowing it was their last round. They simply found over the course of a few years that there was less and less that only they could do. And then one day there was nothing at all. That story of how a technology changes and what happens to the people whose entire skill and livelihood was built around the thing being replaced is one of the most quietly devastating stories in all of history, and it is where we are going next. On the 28th of January 1807, a crowd gathered on Pall Mall in London, not to witness a royal procession, not to mark a political event. They had gathered because a German engineer named Frederick Windsor had promised them something they had never seen before, and the promise was so extraordinary that most of the people in the crowd, including several noted scientists of the day, were fairly confident it was going to fail spectacularly. Windsor had promised to light the street using smoke, not torches, not oil, not the candles and oil lamps that had been the only available options for artificial illumination since the beginning of recorded history. Gas. Specifically the gas produced by heating coal in a sealed vessel. Coal gas, a byproduct of the industrial process being rapidly developed at factories across Britain. Windsor intended to pipe this gas through tubes buried beneath the street and burn it in purpose-built lampposts above the pavement. The lampposts on Pall Mall were for the occasion fed through pipes, fashioned from something wonderfully unlikely, the repurposed barrels of obsolete musket guns welded end to end. The crowd watched as the lamps were lit. They did not fail. They burned steadily brightly with a consistency that oil lamps and candles could not match, unaffected by wind, requiring no wick to be trimmed, producing a light that contemporary observers described as remarkable and even eerie in its steadiness. Sir Humphrey Davy, the distinguished chemist, was apparently among those who dismissed the scheme. He had reportedly suggested that the whole project was so impractical that one might as well use the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral as a gas reservoir. He was in this instance very wrong, By Christmas Day of 1814, general gaslighting had commenced across London. Westminster Bridge had been lit by gas the previous year. The world was changing, and it was changing at the speed of a pipe laid underground. But here is what I want to talk about. Not the triumph of the technology. The people who were already doing the job. Before gas came, London's streets were lit imperfectly and inadequately, often infuriatingly by oil lamps. Parish lamps fueled by fish oil or whale oil, maintained by the local vestry, and lit every evening by a particular class of worker who'd been doing this particular job in various forms since at least the 17th century. The lamplighter. He was in almost every practical sense the direct descendant of Edmund. Not by blood, by function. The lamplighter set out just before dusk, typically carrying a short ladder over one shoulder and a small handheld lamp in the other. He worked a route, a specific circuit of streets assigned to him, sometimes covering hundreds of lampposts in a single evening. He climbed his ladder, opened the oil lamp's glass housing, trimmed the wick if it needed it, lit the flame with his own small torch, descended and moved to the next one. In the morning he made the same circuit in reverse. Up the ladder, extinguished, down, next one. Contemporary accounts from the mid-19th century capture the character of this work with vivid precision. Alfred Rosling Bennett, writing about London in the 1850s and 1860s, described the lamplighter as an elderly man carrying a short ladder and a hand lamp, placing his ladder against the projecting iron arm, provided for the purpose, running up, turning the gas cock, applying his lamp, coming down and away with shouldered ladder to the next beacon. The job had acquired gas, by then the oil lamps had largely been replaced, but the essential choreography of the work was unchanged from what it had been 2 centuries earlier, and unchanged from what Edmund had done with tallow candles in a castle 7 centuries before that. Someone had to go around. Someone had to carry the flame. Someone had to make sure the light was ready before the people who needed it arrived. The lamplighter families of Victorian London were by all accounts a particular kind of community. The work passed from father to son, generation to generation, in a way that made it hereditary in practice, if not in law. A lamplighter family would know their district intimately. Every lamp post, every projecting bar, every corner where the wind came from a particular direction, and the lamp needed an extra moment to catch. At their peak, around 25,000 lamplighters serviced the gaslights of London on any given evening. 25,000 people walking their routes in the dusk, climbing their ladders, applying their flames and walking on. 25,000 descendants in a direct line of function from the candle boys and lamp boys of the medieval castle. They frequented particular public houses. They made marriages within lamplighter families. They had their own traditions, their own professional pride, their own quietly fierce sense of identity, built around work that most of the city used without noticing. They were in the way of all such workers, simultaneously essential and invisible. Now here is where the story becomes the kind of story that history is very good at producing and very bad at recording. Because the end of the lamplighter did not come as a single event. It came as a process. By the 1870s, mechanical wind-up timing clocks were being installed in gas lamp posts. A small clockwork mechanism inside the lamp housing wound once a week, by a maintenance worker, controlled when the gas valve opened and closed. The lamp lit itself at dusk and extinguished itself at dawn. The lamplighter who had walked his route for 20 years found over the course of those years that his route was getting shorter. Not because the city was growing smaller, because the lamps no longer needed him. He still had a job for a while. The clocks needed winding. Broken mantles needed replacing. Lamps that failed to light on a given evening still required someone to investigate. There was still a route, still a ladder, still a district. But the ritual was different. The purpose was different. He was no longer the person who brought the light. He was the person who checked on whether the light had brought itself. That is not the same thing. It does not feel the same. Anyone who's ever had a skill that the world stopped needing knows the particular texture of that change. And then came electricity. Thomas Edison demonstrated a practical incandescent light bulb in 1879. By the 1880s, electric light was being installed in London's wealthier streets and buildings. By the 1890s, it was spreading rapidly. By the early 20th century, gas lamp posts were being replaced district by district, borough by borough. The lamplighter's job did not so much end as dissolve. It dissolved into the general maintenance work of the municipal gas and electricity companies. The man who had once walked a proud, defined route and lit 200 lamps by hand became, if he was lucky, a general utility worker doing odd jobs for the lighting authority. His ladder became a tool among other tools rather than the instrument of a profession, and when he retired, the job itself often retired with him. No apprentice was taken on. No son was taught the route. The lampposts, the ones that remained gas-lit at any rate, were increasingly managed by mechanical timers that needed winding less and less frequently as the technology improved. I want to pause here and say something that I think matters, even though it is uncomfortable. We talk a great deal about technological progress. We celebrate it, and most of the time we are right to celebrate it. Gaslight was better than oil lamps, which were better than candles, which were better than rushlights. Each step represented real improvement, brighter, more reliable, cheaper, safer. The progression from Edmund's tinderbox in the darkness of the castle to the warm automatic consistent electric light in your bedroom ceiling tonight is a story of human ingenuity that I genuinely find astonishing. But progress moves through people. And some of those people are holding skills that progress is about to make irrelevant. The tallow chandler, who had spent 40 years rendering fat and dipping wicks and managing his guild obligations, he found himself in the mid-19th century largely redundant as paraffin wax made candle production cheaper and more industrial. The wax chandler, who had imported beeswax from Flanders and supplied it to the churches and noble houses of England, he watched as gaslight replaced his best customer's need for candles in the first place. The lamplighter, who had taken such pride in knowing every lamp on his route in arriving before the dark, fell, in the small dignity of being the person the city depended on. To light its evenings, he watched the clocks appear, and then the electricity, and understood that his particular usefulness was ending. These are not people who failed. These are people who are excellent at something the world stopped needing. That is a different kind of story, and I think it deserves to be told plainly. Let me share one detail from this period that I find almost unbearably human. London still has approximately 1,500 gas lamps in operation today. They are found in some of the city's oldest neighbourhoods and parks around Buckingham Palace, in the streets near the Inns of Court, along certain stretches of the embankment. They were preserved by English heritage as examples of Victorian infrastructure worth maintaining, and they are still tended by hand. 5 lamplighters employed by British Gas make rounds to wean the clockwork mechanisms inside each lamppost, the small timing clocks that control when the gas valve opens and the flame catches. These clocks must be wound manually at regular intervals to keep accurate time. 5 people, in an entire city of millions, still walking their routes, still climbing their ladders, still applying their flame. One of them, a man named Gary Usher, was assigned to the lamplighter crew some years ago, and reportedly nearly laughed when his boss told him the job still existed. He thought his boss was pulling his leg. He was not. I find something genuinely moving in that, not as a sentimental attachment to the past, but as a recognition that even when almost everything has changed, the essential gesture persists somewhere. Someone still goes around. Someone still makes sure the light is ready. This brings me back to Edmund. He grew up in this story from a 14-year-old boy carrying a tinderbox through a cold castle corridor into we can imagine because the records do not tell us someone who did the work for many years and eventually perhaps taught the next boy who came to the chandlery to do it the same way. He did not know that he was part of a continuous human tradition of managing light. He did not think in those terms. He thought in terms of tonight's candles, tomorrow's allocation, the trimming that needed doing, and the round he had to finish before the household went to sleep. But that is exactly how the oldest traditions are carried. Not through conscious preservation, through the repetition of practical, useful knowledge, through the candle boy who showed the next candle boy how to carry the flame without it guttering in a draught, through the lamplighter who showed his son how to place the ladder at the right angle against the iron bar, through the 5 people who still wind the clocks in 1,500 lampposts in London today, keeping alive a gesture that is 500 years older than the lamps they tend. When you turn off your bedside light tonight, the last light in your room before sleep, if you stop for a moment in the dark before you close your eyes, you are part of the same rhythm that Edmund was part of. The household going quiet, the last flame going out, the darkness settling in like something that was waiting patiently all along. And somewhere in that darkness, if you listen carefully enough, or perhaps just imagine carefully enough, there is the sound of someone walking a corridor with a small light, checking that everything is safe, making sure that the night is properly held, doing the last quiet work that the building requires before it can sleep. The castle is dark, the round is done, all is well. This has been a long journey and we are nearly at the end of it. But there is one more thing to sit with before we rest. Because the light that Edmund carried and the lamplighters carried and the 5 lamp tenders carry today, it was never just about the flame. It was always about what the flame made possible. The work that could be done after dark, the conversation that continued past sunset, the embroidery finished by candlelight, the letter read at midnight, the prayer said before dawn, all the hours that human beings have added to their days by refusing to simply go to bed when the sun went down, all of that is the real legacy of the people who kept the lights burning. And the last chapter of this story is about exactly that. Not the light itself, but what we did with it, what we built in the hours that light gave us back. We're almost there. Somewhere in a monastery in Ireland around the 9th century, a monk was copying a manuscript. He had been at his desk since the light was strong enough to see by, which in the dark months of an Irish winter meant perhaps 6 usable hours if the clouds were thin enough, if the rain had paused. He was cold. We know this because he wrote it in the margin. The margin of a manuscript was not supposed to be a place for personal expression. The monk was there to copy the text exactly as he found it, letter by letter, word by word, without embellishment or interpretation, or any private thought whatsoever. The scriptorium operated under a rule of silence. The director walked the room to ensure the work continued. The walls were bare. The seats were uncomfortable by deliberate design in the belief that comfort encouraged inattention. And still the monks wrote in the margins, complaints mostly, prayers occasionally, and sometimes just the raw, unmediated evidence of a human being doing hard work in difficult conditions and needing for one brief moment to say so to whoever might eventually read the page. One scribe wrote, "Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides." Another wrote, "I am very cold." Another, "The parchment is hairy." Not entirely clear what this means. Probably exactly what it sounds like. Medieval vellum was made from animal skin, and sometimes the preparation was incomplete. It was a legitimate complaint. Another, "While I wrote I froze, and what I could not write by the beams of the sun I finished by candlelight. That last one stops me every time. Because embedded in a complaint about the cold and the effort and the failing light is something rather extraordinary. He finished it. In the dark, by candlelight in the cold, with his back hurting and his fingers stiff, and no particular guarantee that anyone would ever read what he had written, he finished it. And that is why we have it. This is what I want to sit with tonight. We've spent this whole journey looking at the people who made and managed and carried the light. The candle boys and the head chandlers and the guild masters and the sacristan monks and the Victorian lamplighters on their evening routes. We have looked at the flame itself, how it was made, what it cost, who could afford it, what it meant when it burned and what it meant when it went out. But we have not yet fully reckoned with what the light made possible. Not the obvious things, the ability to see after dark, the extension of the working day, the safety of a candle rather than total darkness. The deeper thing. What human beings built, thought, made, wrote, prayed, argued, composed, and imagined in those hours that artificial light gave back to the world. The scriptorium is a good place to start. The scriptorium was the writing room of a medieval monastery, a dedicated space usually near the library built specifically for the copying and illumination of manuscripts. In large abbeys, it could be a substantial room with individual carrels each assigned to a monk for the duration of a copying project. Monks were not supposed to use candlelight in the scriptorium. Let me say that again because the reason is wonderful. They were not permitted to work by candlelight specifically because manuscripts were too valuable and too fragile to risk near an open flame. A single spark, a knocked-over candle, a gust from an open door catching a flame at the wrong moment, the loss would be incalculable. So the monks copied in daylight only. 6 hours in winter perhaps if the light was adequate. A little longer in summer. But the monks who were considered most talented, most productive, whose work was in highest demand, those monks were given an exception. They were given candles. And they were given, alongside the candles, a clock, usually a water clock or a candle clock, to track the hours of their additional working time. The best of the best were exempted from some communal prayers specifically so they could work longer. They were in effect the knowledge workers of the medieval world, and the tool that enabled their extra hours of output was not a new technique, not a new instrument, not a new material. It was a candle, made from beeswax or tallow, dipped by hand in a cold chandlery by someone whose name the records do not contain, placed on the scribe's desk, lit, and from that small flame in those additional hours manuscripts survived. Classical texts that would otherwise have been lost that we now have because some cold monk in some Irish or Italian or German monastery chose to keep working past sunset. Aristotle survived. Cicero survived. Portions of Pliny of Tacitus, of the medical writings of Galen. Not because anyone planned to preserve them, because monks copied them, and the best monks, the ones given extra candles, copied more than the others. The light bought time, the time produced manuscripts. The manuscripts are why we have the ancient world at all. Now the monastery and the castle share the same light source, but they do very different things with the hours that light extends. Let us step back into the castle for a moment. Edmund has been on his rounds for a year and a half now. He knows every corner of the building. He knows the weight of every candlestick. He knows which rooms burn through their allocation fastest and which rooms barely touch their candles because the Lord is often away and the solar sits empty. On a Tuesday evening in November I am inventing the day, but the season is real because November in England is dark and cold and demanding. Edmund completes his round and finds himself with 20 minutes to spare before the head chandler does his final count of the evening. He sits on the low bench near the chandlery hearth. He is tired in the mild, manageable way of someone who has worked steadily and done the work correctly. He reaches into the pocket of his coat, a coat he has owned for 2 years, slightly too small now. The cuffs fraying, and takes out a piece of wax. He's been carving it, not with any skill, not with any intention beyond the occupation of his hands during the brief rests of his day. A rough shape. Something that might be a horse if you held it at the right angle. He works at it with his thumbnail in the firelight. He is not a craftsman, he is a candle boy. But the light is there and the time is there, and his hands know what to do with idle minutes. I do not know if Edmund made a horse or whether he made anything at all, but I believe he did something. Because across the entire medieval world, across every class and every calling, the hours that artificial light extended were filled with human making. The marginalia of medieval manuscripts, those wonderful, strange, heartfelt complaints and jokes that scribes inscribed in the borders of their work, are not just historical curiosities, they are evidence. Evidence that the act of sitting by a candle, working past the natural end of the day in a cold room or a warm one, produces not only the work that was required, but also the overflow of a human mind that cannot quite be entirely subdued by institutional expectations. The monks were supposed to be copying. They were copying. And in the margins they were also drawing rabbits attacking knights, and writing prayers for their aching hands, and noting that the parchment was hairy, and observing with tremendous relief that it would soon be dark and the day's labour would end. That marginalia survived. For 1,000 years, not because anyone decided it was worth preserving, because it was in the same book as the things that were worth preserving. It came along for the ride, and now when historians want to understand what it felt like to be alive in the 9th century, to sit at a desk in a cold scriptorium and do hours of meticulous work and feel cold and tired and human, they read the margins. The thing that was dismissed as irrelevant is 900 years later the most vivid testimony we have. Here is a question worth considering. What do you think was created by candlelight that changed the world? Not in a general rhetorical sense. Specifically, the Gutenberg Bible, the first major book printed with movable type in Europe, completed in the 1450s, was set and printed in a workshop lit by candles and oil lamps. The technology that would eventually make the scribe's careful copying unnecessary was itself made possible by artificial light. Galileo made his observations of the night sky from a tower working by lamplight to record what he saw through his telescope. Isaac Newton's most productive period of scientific work, the years during which he worked out the foundations of his theory of gravity and the mathematics of calculus, occurred during the Great Plague of London in 1665 and 1666, when he retreated from Cambridge to his family home in Lincolnshire. He worked by candlelight. He produced in those 2 years of isolated lamplit evenings a body of work that would shape the next 4 centuries of human understanding. Shakespeare wrote his plays for performance in daylight. The Globe Theatre had no roof, but revised them, amended them, and surely thought through their construction by candlelight in whatever room he happened to be sleeping in. I am not claiming that these people needed bad light to do great things. I am claiming that the light was there, that someone had made it, placed it, trimmed it, and kept it burning, that the quiet work of keeping the flame going was a condition of everything else. The Irish monk who finished his manuscript by candlelight did not know he was preserving something important. He was cold and tired and he wanted to stop. He kept going anyway. And 1400 years later we have the text he was copying. That is the full shape of the story, I think. Not the heroic version where the important work is done by important people in important rooms. The real version where the important work is done by cold, tired, ordinary people who kept going past the point where they could reasonably be expected to keep going because the light was still there and the work was not finished. And finishing things is what you do when you have the tools to do it. Edmund will grow older in this castle. He will learn the chandlery's work more deeply. He will eventually be the one who knows the 6-month stock needs and the seasonal variations in candle consumption. He will teach the next candle boy the route. He will not leave a manuscript. He will not leave a painting. He will not leave a building or a theorem or a recorded piece of music. He will leave the knowledge that the light was kept, not for 1 night or 1 month, but for the entire span of his working life in this building. every book that was read by the light he placed, every letter that was written, every prayer that was said, every conversation that continued past the point where the darkness would have ended it. All of that is in some small and uncountable way his, not his alone, his and Walter, the head chandlers, and the chambermaids, and the widows who ran the chandler's shop on the corner of the street outside the castle walls, and the monks who kept their beehives, and the guild members who argued in court about the purity of their beeswax, and the 5 people today who still ride their bicycles around certain streets of London, stopping at each lamp-post, opening the small glass door and winding the clock by hand. The light has always required someone. We are almost at the end of this story, and I want the very last part of it to be exactly what it says on the label. Not a conclusion, not a summary, not a lesson. Just a few minutes together in the quiet at the end of the night. Because that is what this kind of story is for. The day is done. The rounds are finished. The candles are where they need to be. Let us rest. Here is something that I have been saving for last. Something small and very old and probably very familiar to you. At some point in your life, maybe many points, you have sat in front of a birthday cake. The lights have gone down. The room has gone quiet in that specific, slightly self-conscious way that rooms go quiet around birthday cakes. Someone is carrying the cake toward you, and there are candles on it, however many, whatever colours, and they are burning. And then you close your eyes and make a wish. You do this without thinking about it, without needing to be told, as naturally as breathing. What you probably do not know, what almost no one thinks about in that moment, is that this gesture is older than the castle we've been living in throughout this story. The ancient Greeks made round cakes as offerings to Artemis, the goddess of the moon. They placed candles on the cakes to represent the glow of moonlight. And when the candles were blown out, the rising smoke was believed to carry the prayers and wishes of the offerer upward through the air toward whatever forces governed human fortune. Smoke as messenger, flame as connection, the extinguishing of a candle as a final deliberate act of hope. The gesture travelled from ancient Greece into medieval German tradition, where it appeared in the 18th century in the form of the Kinderfest, the children's birthday celebration, in which a single large candle represented the light of a child's life burning through the day. And from there it travelled into the modern birthday cake you have sat in front of, sitting in the gentle dark, making a wish, doing something sacred without knowing it is sacred at all. This is what I find most extraordinary about the story we've been telling tonight. Not the grand sweep of it, the monasteries and the guilds and the gaslights on Pall Mall, and the 5 lamp tenders still winding their clocks in London today. Not even the quiet heroism of the people who kept the lights going, Edmund and the sacristan and the chambermaids, and the medieval widows who ran their candle shops on borrowed authority. What I find most extraordinary is the persistence of the gesture, the reaching for a flame. Human beings have been doing it for as long as human beings have existed in a recognizable form. We've done it in grief, and in celebration, and in prayer, and in necessity, and in fear, and in the simple daily administration of a life that continues after dark. We do not do it because we have to anymore. We do it because something in us remembers that we did. The birthday candle is the memory of every candle that ever mattered. The church taper is the memory of the Candlemas procession. The dinner candle on the table tonight is the memory of every beeswax candle that ever burned in a medieval great hall before a feast. We have kept the gesture even after we stopped needing the flame. That seems important to me. It seems like something worth noticing. Let me tell you one more thing about candlelight before we let tonight go quiet. There is a scientific reason why candlelight feels intimate. It is not nostalgia. It is not association. It is your eyes. Human eyes evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to respond to the light levels that exist in nature. Daylight signals, alertness, attention, the full engagement of the visual system. The bright overhead electric lights we use in offices and classrooms and fluorescent lit supermarkets are on the scale of human evolutionary history brand new. We have been living with them for about a century, which is not very long at all. Candlelight, on the other hand, sits right at the lower end of the range of light under which human beings have done the majority of their indoor waking work for most of human history. It tells your nervous system that the day is done, that whatever urgent thing was happening is over now, that the quality of attention required for the next few hours is different, quieter, slower, more inward. Your pupils dilate slightly in candlelight. Your breathing slows, something unclenches. The people who sat around a candle in a medieval castle after the dinner plates had been cleared and the steward had gone to his accounts and the children had been put to bed, they were not experiencing candlelight as atmosphere. They were experiencing it as the world returning to its natural state, the day coming to rest, the body following. I find myself thinking at this point in the story about all the conversations that have happened by candlelight. Not recorded conversations, not the ones that ended up in letters or chronicles or diplomatic dispatches, the ordinary ones. The mother telling her child a story in a small room in a castle in the 13th century, the candle between them casting soft light on both their faces. The two old friends, the ones who have known each other so long that silence between them is comfortable sitting together after a meal with a single candle burning on the table. The person who could not sleep sitting with their thoughts in the dark hours of the watch with a small flame to keep them company. None of these conversations were recorded. All of them happened. Millions of them across hundreds of years in every language, in every kind of room. And in all of them, the candlelight was doing what candlelight does, holding a space, making it possible to be present with another person or with oneself in a way that harsh light does not quite permit. Medieval people did not have a word for this. They did not need one. They just lived inside the fact of it every evening for their entire lives. The light gathered them together, and in being gathered they were in some particular and irreducible sense human. So what is this story about? Really, I have been asking myself that question since I started putting it together, and I have changed my answer several times. At first I thought it was about light, the technology of it, the economics of it, the strange and detailed world of medieval chandlery. Then I thought it was about the people who kept the light going, the unnamed workers at the foundation of every historical moment that gets written about. Then I thought it was about what those workers made possible, the manuscripts and the prayers and the conversations and the candle clocks of Alfred the Great, and the monks with their complaints about hairy parchment. But I think the real answer is simpler than any of those. I think this story is about attention, about the specific quality of attention that a flame demands. You cannot ignore a candle the way you can ignore a light switch. A flame moves. It responds to the air. It changes second by second in ways that are subtle but real. It requires, if you are responsible for it, a kind of ongoing watchfulness that is not anxious exactly, but not passive either. Edmund, walking his rounds, was paying a particular kind of attention to the building he was moving through. The sacristan lighting the monastery church was paying attention. The Victorian lamplighter on his route reading the wind before he climbed his ladder was paying attention. This attention, steady, practical, largely unacknowledged, is what kept the lights burning, and the lights burning is what kept everything else possible. We have come a long way together tonight. From a cold castle corridor in the 13th century before the sun was fully up, following a 14-year-old boy with a tinderbox through rooms that were still dark. Through the chandlery and its daily rhythms, its beeswax and its tallow, its mice and its guild politics and its careful seasonal accounting, into the monastery where monks lit candles at 2 in the morning to pray and complained about the cold in the margins of the things they were copying. Along the routes that lamplighters walked from the medieval candle boy, all the way to the 5 people still tending the last gas lamps of London on bicycles, stopping at each post, winding each clock, and through all of it back again and again to the flame itself, small, warm, demanding attention, the thing that made everything else possible. Whenever you light a candle, now a birthday candle, a dinner candle, a candle you light, because the power has gone out or because you simply wanted the particular quality of that light in your room, I hope you will think just for a moment about the very long chain of human effort that brought that gesture to you. The beekeepers, the chandlers, the guild members arguing in court, the candle boys dipping wicks in cold chandleries before the rest of the house was awake, the monks with cold hands copying old texts past the point where daylight was enough, the lamplighters setting out at dusk with their ladders and their small flames. Every one of them did a version of the same thing. They made it possible for the light to be there when someone needed it. And that is not a small thing. It has never been a small thing. Thank you for being here tonight. Truly. Not in a perfunctory way, in the way you thank a guest for making the journey, for sitting down, for deciding that this particular kind of slow and quiet company was worth their evening. If you made it all the way here to the end of this long, gentle wander through the candlelit rooms of 8 centuries, then something in you wanted this. The stillness, the sense of things settling, the particular pleasure of knowing something you did not know before, something small and human and true about the people who came before us and the light they kept burning. You do not need to do anything with this. You do not need to take notes or share it or remember all the names and dates. Just carry the feeling if you can. The feeling of the chandlery warm in the cold morning, the feeling of the monastery bell in the dark, the feeling of a candle burning steadily in a room where someone is doing work that matters. If this kind of story is what you want to sleep to, then there is more where this came from. Every quiet corner of history has its own version of the candle boy. The person at the bottom of the hierarchy doing the work nobody notices, making possible everything that everyone else does. We have barely begun to find them all, and the next one I promise you is worth waiting for. Sleep well. The light is safe, the rounds are done, the castle is dark and quiet and at rest, as it should be.